Hi friends, I've had a couple of people say that they like listening to my episodes while they fall asleep. I'm going to take that as flattering and that they like my voice and not insulting that they think I'm boring. Anyway, they both requested that I start making the occasional compilation video so that they can put them on while they drift off. I had a third person who also requested longer compilations for them to listen to while they do the house cleaning. So evidently this is something that some people want. Apparently playlists don't work for this purpose, as you just get more ads and they can get stuck, etc. Or you have to click skip, and you can't do that if you're trying to sleep or if you're washing up or whatever. I wasn't sure how to do this in a way that would actually make sense and not just be a cheap cut and paste of random videos, but then the idea occurred to me to combine my 3 game keycard videos into one, removing most of the improvised intros and outros and some of the repetition of ideas, just making one very long but slightly more streamlined experience for those that like the really long form content. And once I realized that having Trilogy in the title gave me the excuse to make a Star Wars Mario parody thumbnail, there was no stopping that train. Some of you will know that I work in the film industry and I've worked on several Star Wars movies, and I'm a big Star Wars fan, so there we go. If you've never watched the channel before and just discovered it because of the thumbnail, welcome. I hope you'll stick around and listen. This is a fascinating subject, and these 3 videos have been 3 of my most well-received, and certainly the ones with the most comments and some great discussions. And if you're a regular viewer, don't worry, this is a bonus video. It doesn't replace a normal episode. I'm just leaving it uploading while I'm asleep. It's not stopping me working. And if you like the idea of these compilations every now and again, let me know. Or if you hate them, I guess let me know too. Apparently any engagement is good for the algorithm. Like, subscribe, support the show, and join our free members area, linktree/dailyswitch2. That's linktr.ee/dailyswitch2. Thanks, guys. And thank you to those 3 of you who requested a compilation video in the first place. I hope that this is the kind of thing that you had in mind. Sweet dreams, or good luck with the house cleaning, or gym workouts, or whatever you want to use this for. Now, back over to me in the past. Allez. Okay, let's be real. Third-party games simply aren't selling on Switch 2. Physical retail copies are selling terribly, if at all. Game keycards absolutely suck, and Nintendo is doing everything it possibly can to screw over third parties in order to make a quick buck. And even Nintendo's longtime biggest fans are staying away. Or at least all of that is the narrative that I see hopping around on social media. But is any of it actually true? Well, I am both a crazy shelf collector who has bought an insanely unnecessary amount of Nintendo games for about 3.5 decades. And I have over 2 decades of experience in publishing a huge amount of retail entertainment products to major retailers, including Blu-ray, DVDs, and books. And I'm also a third-party developer of indie games, with multiple games lined up for Switch 1, and I'd previously planned on releasing them on Switch 2, but I'm actually having some doubts. So I think I'm in a good position to break all this down from every single possible angle. We're going to get right into the meat and potatoes of this spicy meatball of a mixed metaphor. So let me just quickly read the podcast introduction and we can jump right into things. I have no idea why I turned into Alex there. Hello there, lovely people. Welcome to Daily Switch 2, a podcast covering everything related to the Nintendo Switch 2 with at least one new episode uploaded per day to YouTube, Spotify, and your favorite major platforms. My name is Sam, and I've been a gamer since the 1980s. I've worked in the entertainment industry since I was a teenager, including as a games journalist, producer of gaming documentaries and shows, and I'm even programming multiple indie video games, including 4 which will be released on the Switch and hopefully Switch 2 addendum in this video. So be sure to subscribe and follow the show for the world-exclusive news on those as they drop. However, I'm a gamer and Nintendo fan at heart, and this podcast is purely a passion project for me to talk about the stuff that interests and excites me about this new system. It's not monetized or funded by any entity. It's completely unofficial and unbiased so that I can give my full, frank, honest opinions. So, if you want to support me or just find out the best places to get these free daily episodes or to join our free members area where you can talk to me and leave suggestions and take part in monthly free giveaways to win official Nintendo prizes, all links are in the bio and at linktree/dailyswitch2. That's linktr.ee Daily Switch 2. Thank you so much, and back to the episode. So what is it specifically that we're going to be talking about today? Well, several things, but what it all boils down to is Nintendo making some frankly baffling decisions which are hurting general consumers, passionate collectors who are longtime fans, and third-party and indie devs. And as I said, I definitely fall into pretty much all of those categories, except being a casual consumer. So this is close to my heart. We're going to cover game keycards, code in a box, only 64GB cartridge sizes, minimum runs, digital distribution, and eShop issues, and how Nintendo setting such high prices for their own games and accessories is indirectly damaging third parties, which will inevitably end up damaging the long-term success of the console if third parties stay away, like they largely did with the N64, GameCube, Wii U, and even the Wii and Super Nintendo to some extent. So let's set the scene. The Switch One has been a runaway success. It's possibly the best-selling console of all time. Sony recently put out a very vague figure about the PS2, but at the very least, the Switch One is Nintendo's biggest-selling console ever, at over 150 million units. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that that isn't 150 million unique people that own a Switch. For example, families quite possibly buy more than one. Parents might want to play. Each kid might want their own system, especially when you've got things like Animal Crossing, which was extremely unfeasibly popular around about 2020 for reasons that we won't specify so early because of the YouTube algorithm. And that particular game only allowed one save per system. So if you had, multiple family members and multiple children who wanted to play, you needed multiple systems. And even if you're just a single person buying a system, there have been multiple variations. They made a second edition with better battery life, and then we had the Switch Lite, which was in some ways nicer and more portable. It's my favorite way to play the Switch One portably, at least. And then the Switch OLED model, which obviously had many upgrades. Plus, there's crazy collectors, and I put myself in that kind of category, who buy every variant. All different color versions, limited editions, Zelda versions of the console, Mario versions of the console, Animal Crossing versions of the console. So, yeah, the 150 million units doesn't mean there's 150 million players, but Mario Kart has sold something like 30 million copies, I think, so we can safely assume that conservatively there's at least 50 million unique Switch One players that exist. Whether they're all still playing is debatable. I think many people fell off over time. The Switch 2 is arguably released far later than it should have been. But as well as being a huge hardware success, it's been an enormous sales success for games as well, which is far from a given when a console is successful, especially for Nintendo. For example, they previously had problems shifting games for the Wii. The Wii was their biggest selling home console, and was the biggest selling home console of that generation, beating out the PS3 and the Xbox 360. But software sales were dismal, especially after the first couple of years, because many of the people buying the console were just casual consumers, people who didn't usually play games, and they bought it specifically because they wanted to use Wii Sports, which obviously was the pack-in, or maybe Wii Fit for working out at home, doing yoga, that kind of thing. And maybe if you were lucky, you might buy some Mario Kart, or Just Dance was very popular on the system, for casual people to play at kind of house parties, when you invite people around, children's birthday parties, or friends coming around for drinks and a pizza or whatever. Good multiplayer system, but if that's all that you want the system for, that doesn't translate to enough software to sustain a console. Nintendo have previously had problems selling third-party games on multiple of their platforms. In fact, after the NES, which was a huge system for third parties, pretty much every console after that has had some kind of issue with third parties, either at the beginning or as time went by. But this wasn't the case with the Switch One. Quite the opposite, so it really bucked the trend for Nintendo. The Switch 2 console itself, which has only been out for, 2 weeks now, by all accounts, it's been an unqualified major success in its launch window for the hardware, at least. So I'm going to read a quote from Matt Piscatella. RGT used a different quote from Piscatella, and we will get on to that later. But what Sean didn't give much context to, not blaming him, but perhaps he thought people in his audience would know this, or that it didn't matter. But for context, I think I should, say why he's worth listening to. Piscatella is the executive director of Circana, who are a data analyst company of the video games industry. And many, many people don't like video games analysts because anybody can call themselves that. In fact, any guy who just goes on social media and regularly enough talks about industry news, the non-gaming journalists are quite lax in who they will accept as an expert. I know this personally because I myself have been asked in major newspapers and TV news and things like this to speak as an expert on the games industry, as have several of my friends who are like me, just YouTubers and game fans. But Piscatella and his Circana company works with massive retailers, including Walmart, which is probably the biggest physical sales of games in America, and Amazon, which is probably the biggest digital sales of games, at least by digital I mean it's a website where people can buy games, predominantly physical, but and also they work with games companies including Activision, Blizzard, and Ubisoft. So you don't really get much bigger than that. Previous to that, he was director and US video games analyst for the NPD Group. He spent over 7 years as director and then vice president of sales planning and analysis for Warner Brothers Entertainment. And right before that, nearly 4 years at Activision, rising in the ranks from analyst to director of business intelligence. So, yeah, in theory, this guy should know exactly what he's talking about and certainly does have industry insights from major retailers and publishers, which other people might not necessarily have access to. So the first quote that we're going to give from Piscatella is this. Nintendo Switch 2 enjoyed a record-breaking launch in the US market. Here are just a few fun facts from its debut from Circana's retail tracking service. Nintendo Switch 2 set an all-time launch week unit sales record for video game hardware in the US, with over 1.1 million units sold during the week ending in June the 7th, 2025. Excludes sales from the My Nintendo store, so the numbers are actually even higher, because you can assume a decent amount of people would have bought directly from Nintendo. That was an addendum that I added. Carrying on the quote, the record was previously held by the PlayStation 4. Interesting. 79% of US Nintendo Switch buyers also purchased Mario Kart World, either physically or as part of the Mario Kart World Switch 2 hardware bundle. The top 3 best-selling Switch 2 physical video games sold in the week were units 1. Mario Kart World, 2. Cyberpunk 2077, 3. The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom Nintendo Switch 2 edition. Now, what does the units mean there? I assume what that means is that you're counting the top 3 by how many units sold, not by how much money was spent on them. However, Mario Kart World and Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom are both $80 games, which is the most expensive games. In fact, they are the 2 most expensive games currently available for the system. And Cyberpunk is a $70 game, which is the most expensive tier of third-party games so far. There's been no $80 third-party games so far. So I don't think he needed to specify units there, because it would be exactly the same if we included the price rather than the units. So just taking that quote from Piscatella at face value, you'd assume that this would all be incredible news for third-party devs, indie devs, and the like. Obviously, the Switch 1 is a huge success, but a bit long in the tooth. Even Nintendo have trouble with their most recent first-party games on the Nintendo Switch 1 to have them play reasonably without frame pacing and stuttering and resolution dynamic changing and all kinds of things that make you wish it had a little bit more power. So the Switch 2 is essentially just an iterative version of the Switch 1, but more powerful, which everyone wanted. So everyone is sure that the Switch 2 will be a massive success, and all third parties are climbing over themselves to put their games out. It should have been an easy slam dunk for Nintendo. In fact, I was interviewed a year or two ago for a different podcast and asked what I wanted from Switch 2 as a dev and as a fan. And I said literally, basically, what it is. I didn't want Nintendo to try and reinvent the wheel and come up with some crazy new control scheme or gimmick, multiple screens, 3D virtual reality, something that we haven't even thought of. No, I wanted basically Switch 2, a more powerful version of the Switch 1. It's fully backwards compatible, can play Switch 1 games, preferably plays the Switch 1 games nicer and has better frame rates and maybe higher resolution in certain games. But the most important thing was that it was powerful enough to be able to play pretty reasonable versions of current gen games, so that third parties wouldn't really have any problems releasing games on the Switch 2 that they were also releasing on the PS5 and the Xbox Series. Also, I wanted PC games to be easily convertible across, and I wanted it to be fully backwards compatible to encourage as many players of the Switch 1 as possible to upgrade to the Switch 2. Because as a developer myself, do I want to release a game on a brand new system that only has a small current user base, or do I want to release it on an old system but there's maybe 60 million people out there with units in their hands? You would think it would be easier to sell more copies to those 60 million people, but in the launch window of a new console, people are more likely to buy games for that new console because they, want to try out their shiny new hardware. We saw that with, for example, brand new 3DS games tanking in sales after the Switch. And every time there was a new 3DS game announced, there was outcry of, okay, yeah, it looks great, but I don't want to buy a 3DS game. I want to buy a Switch game. Why didn't they release this on Switch? My prime example of that would be Yoshi's Woolly World, or Yoshi and Poochie's Woolly World, I think it was called. I love Yoshi's Woolly World on the Wii U. I think it's one of the greatest platform games that Nintendo have ever made, and that's saying something because they've made excellent platformers over the years, many of the all-time classics, obviously, but it's one of those games that's sadly stuck on the Wii U. Almost every big game on the Wii U got a conversion to the Switch one, but for some reason Yoshi's Woolly World hasn't, although there are strong rumours that the Switch 2 will get a version. But having the Switch existing as a console, but then having the port or the re-release that everybody was wanting be released on the 3DS, and in some ways therefore being downgraded because of the lower resolution, etc., it seemed to defy logic. And although there was a very large install base for the 3DS, the last few games that released on it really didn't sell very many copies. So as a developer, you've got to think about that when you're releasing a new system. Do you want to release on the Switch because it has a larger, in theory, customer base? Do you want to release on the Switch 2? Because it's the latest and greatest, and many of the old customers from the Switch 1 will have upgraded to the Switch 2, so they'll be wanting to buy only Switch 2 games. Or, if it's backwards compatible, can you release for the Switch 1, but market it heavily as this plays really well on the Switch 2? That's, something which was a heavy consideration for me, and as I say, unfortunately there's some issues with third parties, but we'll get into that later. For now, looking at the Switch 2 games themselves, despite the console itself selling around 4 million units in its first week, and that's including the 1.1 million in the US, but 4 million worldwide, the game business published an article saying third-party games on Nintendo Switch 2 are selling disastrously. Quote, one third-party publisher characterized the numbers as beyond our lowest estimates despite strong hardware sales. End quote. So even though the system has sold far better than expected, the third-party games are selling far lower than expected, meaning that the problem is even larger than it would at first appear. In the US, at least, over 80% of the Switch 2 software sales came from physical retailers. So people walking into a shop to pick up games. Presumably at the same time as the console, because in general, people don't do that anymore. Other than on launch days or special occasions, even people who collect physical copies of games rather than buying digitally, they tend to buy via Amazon or some other online retailer to get them posted to their house. But 80%, over 80% of Switch 2 software sales came from physical retailers. So that means that people aren't necessarily ordering physical games online. They aren't pre-ordering games or even buying games other than whatever they chose to pick up at the exact same time as the console. And that is a huge problem because, of course, when you buy the console, you are spending a lot of money up front in one go, and you can't really afford to buy many games at the same time. In fact, I'd wager that most people only bought the console and Mario Kart bundle. Piscatella's 79% stat includes the bundle. So that means that 21% of people that bought a Switch bought the console only, without Mario Kart. Because Piscatella says 79% of people bought Mario Kart, but that includes the bundle. So 21% of people that bought a Switch bought the console only, without Mario Kart, and didn't buy the physical copy of Mario Kart. So does that mean that 21% of people that bought a Switch on day one have no intention of buying Mario Kart? The only major launch title exclusive, they have literally no interest in it, but they still decided to buy the very expensive console right away in the first week? For what? Just to play their Switch 1 games with slightly nicer Joy-Cons, but a slightly worse screen than the OLED model? I know some people will call me out on 1080 versus 720 thing, but that's a whole other video. The screen is not good. It's not terrible at all, but it's not good in inverted commas, and I've promised a whole other video on why, and again, how it actually affects my personal decision to make games for the system as a developer. There's issues with it that we don't have time to get into here, but if you are interested in the tech side of things, subscribe, as I'll be going over it in a lot of detail, and not just the Digital Foundry kind of way, but from a developer perspective with some stuff that I haven't actually seen anyone else talking about. But then again, as I said, I don't use Twitter anymore. So it seems more likely that a large amount of the 21% buying the console without Mario Kart probably wanted to buy Mario Kart, but simply couldn't immediately afford it because of the elevated cost of the system. Some others were probably scalpers, hoping that there would be retail shortages and they could buy the cheapest possible version of the system, then add a massive markup. And while I don't want to knock the hustle of someone desperately trying to find a way to make money in this current economy, I'm personally pretty glad that Nintendo have actually manufactured enough consoles so that there isn't a stock shortage and you can basically walk into any retailer and buy one at RRP. I understand the people who are laughing at the scalpers losing money. I saw a clip of Pat Contry of CU Podcast looking up real time on eBay and finding over 10,000 Switches for sale from scalpers on eBay in America, and many of them were actually losing money for the scalper by the time you factor in things like eBay's fees and PayPal fees and postage, because people don't want to pay more than retail because you can basically walk into any retailer and buy one at RRP. So for those people who actually did buy Mario Kart, that 79% stat, either in the bundle or like me wanting a physical version to put on their shelf, it's a safe bet that many of those people didn't buy any other games. We don't have officially released figures of how many physical or digital games have been sold. Analysts like Piscatella have data that would at least allow a rough estimate of this, but are being very cagey about making any statements. I believe because it paints a very, very dark picture. But we can assume with a reasonable level of certainty that if 21% of people aren't even buying the pack-in game, which is considered by most to be the only must-buy, in inverted commas, game at launch, there's going to be a large amount of people that bought 0 games just wanting to secure their console in case of shortages, use it in the meantime to play their Switch 1 titles, and choose to buy Switch 2 games at a later date, maybe on their next paycheck or once they've recovered. They will never financially recover from this kind of thing. There are actually several very likely and completely valid reasons that people might buy the console with no games, and I'll cover those later too. Some people will want to argue that a lot of people either don't like Mario Kart or have been put off by the negative reviews online, so instead bought the Switch 2 to play other games. Perhaps they really want a portable version of Cyberpunk, No Man's Sky, Sonic X Shadow Generations, or even the more niche titles like the multiple RPGs, strategy games, life sims, etc. And that sounds kind of convincing. But let's look at the quote again. Over 80% of software sales come from physical retailers. So that means less than 20% of people have bought any digital games in the first week, because it's over 80% of software sales were from physical retailers. And in general, physical retailers don't sell digital download codes. Less than 20% of people bought any digital games in the first week, not even first-party games. And that completely tracks with my theory that 21% that didn't buy Mario Kart actually bought no games at all. To reiterate, we don't know the exact numbers, but many people, a significant margin, bought only the console with 0 games. If we assume that the US market is reflective of trends around the whole world, that's 4 million console sales. That 4 million console sales means that around 800,000 people, close to 1 million, bought a console but with no games. Again, 0. That's insane. I don't think that has ever happened before, not in the history of video games. Certainly not for a major console. Obviously, you have handhelds that play bootlegs and things like that, but not for a major retail release console. Again, I can posit why that might be the case, and we'll talk about it later, but for now, let's look at the 3.2 million people that did buy at least one game. At least one game, very much in inverted commas, because buying a game is somewhat of an exaggeration. I'd wager a huge amount of that 3.2 million people just bought the bundle with Mario Kart and stopped there. So for now, we don't have figures, and it seems like they're being held back to not damage future retail and sales prospects too badly with negative publicity. Shouting from the rooftops that the Switch 2 has record console sales means that more people are going to want to buy, having a positive outlook on the system or having FOMO. I'd guess that that's a big reason that many industry people have been strongly speaking out against anyone daring to criticize Mario Kart World 2. Despite the obvious flaws and lukewarm fan reception that we're seeing from aggregates. People in the industry want the Switch 2 to be a success, to continue the good times they've been having with the Switch 1. And to be clear, I'm in the industry, and I want that too. And I want it as a fan. But I'm not going to lie, I'm not going to sugarcoat. I recently uploaded a full podcast episode to Spotify and YouTube, split into 2 parts, where I did a full rundown and basic review of every one of the 25 Switch 2 launch titles. And the feedback to it has been pretty universally positive overall. But In order to try and ride the algorithm a bit and get a few more people to check out the full-length episode, I also made several clips where I cut out the portions for specific games and released them on YouTube. And in the video on Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, I've had some fairly vocal pushback from people that seem upset that I would dare to criticize Nintendo, even though in that same short clip I state that in my opinion they are two of the best games of all time, and even though I think the Switch 2 editions are overpriced, if you have never owned the games before, there is still good value for money when compared to other forms of entertainment, like buying a movie ticket, Blu-ray, eating out, going bowling, or whatever. But it seems that to certain fans, even this mild criticism was too much, and some people assume I'm a Nintendo hater or I want Switch 2 to fail. Let's be logical for a second, okay? I am the host of the Daily Switch 2 podcast. As I say in every introduction, this is not monetized in any way, and I am not sponsored or affiliated with Nintendo or any other commercial entity. It's just me, sat in my room, making these episodes, recording, editing, uploading at great expense in not just hours every day, but for literally zero income and a pretty huge cost in buying a console, games, and accessories to cover in the show. Why am I doing it? Well, perhaps in the future it might grow and start to cover its own costs, but that's a long way off, if ever. It will probably take at least 6 months to get even monetized by YouTube, if that ever happens. And while I do have a Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee account set up, right now I haven't had a single donation and I don't expect to anytime soon. I'm not e-begging. If you're listening to this, please don't take it as me trying to ask for donations. No. Right now, in this economy, and with the highly elevated price of the console and games, I'd actually encourage you to save your money. If you want to help, just subscribe, drop a like or a comment. There is a completely free tier on my Patreon, which again actually costs me money to run because I thought it would be a fun thing to do to buy a ton of little official Nintendo Gacha prizes and give them away to members. If you want to join for free, it is linktree/dailyswitch2, linktr.ee/dailyswitch2. But again, I don't bring this up to draw attention to this channel or e-beg or anything else. In fact, I haven't even brought up any of this in previous episodes, as I actually think it's kind of gross to talk about this stuff at all. Sure, I put links in the description, the pinned comments, but you've never heard me ask for donations, and I never will. You can hold me to that. I'm just glad that people are listening. The only reason I'm mentioning it now is it's baffling to me that people are somehow getting the opinion that I hate Nintendo and I want Switch 2 to fail. If that was the case, why would I have chosen to make this podcast, make these YouTube videos, spent countless hours per day working on it all by myself? This is my hobby, and it's an expensive one at that, but I'm doing it because I love Nintendo, and I've been so excited for the Switch 2, and I want to create a space where I can talk endlessly about how hyped I am for all the latest first-party games. Anyone who saw my coverage of the Donkey Kong Bonanza Direct can't possibly have thought that I'm anything else but a huge Nintendo fan, an almost obsessive level of collecting Nintendo games and systems since the 80s, and beyond excited for the future of Switch 2. And on top of this, as a games dev myself, why on earth would I want the system to fail? I need the console to be a success so that my games for it have a chance of selling. So the idea that I want the Switch 2 to fail is preposterous to me. I'm sorry if all of that sounded like a rant. I felt myself getting passionate there, or even could be interpreted as self-advertising or self-aggrandizement. That's not the intention. I just can't believe that some of the comments I got after I dared to say that $80 is too much for a re-release of Tears of the Kingdom, or Breath of the Wild should have included the DLC on the cartridge. How dare I? I know. Fake Nintendo fan, Sony fanboy, whatever else people implied that I was in the comments. It's insane. But yeah, rant aside, 3.2 million people bought at least one Let's look into that. Looking back at his quote, it says, the top 3 best-selling Switch 2 physical video games sold in the first week were Mario Kart World, number 1, Cyberpunk 2077, number 2, number 3, Legend of Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom, Nintendo Switch 2 Edition. Again, we weren't given quotes beyond that by Piscatella, and I've already at least implied that I think he's misleading by omission on purpose to paint a rosy picture with multiple of his quotes, including one that is flat out ridiculous to the point that it's basically wrong, and I'll get to that later. But let's look at those 3. Mario Kart World at number 1. It's not surprising that it's the number 1 game on the system. That was a given, but he specified physical. And that's a pretty bad sign, actually. Because surely the majority of people that bought Mario Kart World actually bought the Switch 2 bundle that came with the game digitally. Sure, there are crazy fanboy shelf collectors like me that paid $80 to get a physical copy, but the vast majority of people can be assumed to have bought the bundle in order to save $30 on what is already a very expensive system with extremely cynically overpriced accessories. I did another episode where I reviewed every officially available accessory, many of which people will consider essential, especially when buying for their kids, like a carry case with screen protector, a camera for playing online, memory cards, extra Joy-Cons or a Pro controller for multiplayer, an extra dock so the kids can play on the TV in their bedroom while the parents are watching TV in the lounge. Without fail, every accessory that I covered was not bad quality. But with no exceptions, they were all priced at least 30% higher than what I would have expected and 50% higher than what I'd actually consider good value. So yeah, with the price of entry being that high, you can't tell me that many people chose to pay the extra $30 to get the physical edition of Mario Kart. But the game I assume that not many people bought is the number 1 selling physical release. It's not a good sign. Number 2 selling physical release is Cyberpunk, and in a way I don't think that will surprise too many people. It's by far the most anticipated of the third-party lineups, and the one that's been getting the most attention in advertising, etc. Even people who usually only play first-party releases of colourful, cartoony games on their Nintendo might be interested to buy Cyberpunk in order to really show off what their new system can do from a technical perspective. It's a visual showpiece for absolute sure. And for those that care, it's one of only 2 third-party games in the launch lineup where the full game is on the cartridge. One of only 2. We'll get into the game keycard situation soon enough, but it's certainly something that will have persuaded a decent percentage of people to buy over other third-party AAA releases, which will require a 20 to 60 gigabyte download before you can play, and eat up a large chunk of the relatively small 256 gigabyte built-in memory. Again, we'll cover the keycard and digital situations later, but for now, let's say it's a factor in Cyberpunk being a success to some extent. Remains to be seen exactly how many people care about this issue, but I'd wager it's a decent chunk. Piscatella's statement ends at number 3, which is Tears of the Kingdom, Nintendo Switch 2 Edition. It's interesting to note that Tears of the Kingdom outsold Breath of the Wild, especially because it's $80 compared to Breath of the Wild at $10 less. But realistically, Breath of the Wild is a game that is, 8 years old or more? And die-hard Nintendo fans may even have already bought and played it on both the Wii U and the Switch. And again, I'm one of those crazy people that buys every single version of every first-party game, even re-releases, and the same game on multiple systems. I just like to collect them. What I'd actually wager is that because many people didn't actually buy Tears of the Kingdom the first time around, it's easy to forget nowadays, but it was a controversial game at launch. Firstly, because it was their perception that it was just a glorified DLC for Breath of the Wild, Personally, I don't think that's fair or valid, but I can absolutely see how it can be argued, especially at the time, and if you don't actually play the game and you just look at trailers and the like. But the second big controversy, and the reason many stayed away, was it was Nintendo's first and only game to release at $70 on the Switch 1. $10 higher than the previous maximum. Combine that with the perception that it should have been DLC, and the fact that some people had a bit of Breath of the Wild fatigue, having played it for hundreds of hours, and Tears of the Kingdom didn't seem quite as tempting to a good amount of fans. But now that the dust has settled, now that it's well established that it's a good game and significantly different to the previous title, there will perhaps be a number of people who never bought the game on Switch 1 but are willing to give it a chance on their shiny new Switch 2. It would be interesting to know just how many copies it sold, though as it's below physical Mario Kart, despite that being the pack-in bundle, so little reason to buy it physically, and even below the third-party game Cyberpunk, which is in a genre that wouldn't typically be played by Nintendo games or by Nintendo's core customer. It's safe to say that the numbers aren't enormous. We know that only 3.2 million bought a game of any kind, including the bundle. That's what makes it so painful. What's a reasonable number of people to assume that they chose to spend $30 more just to get the cartridge for Mario Kart? 20% of people? 20% of people who bought Mario Kart chose to pay $30 more rather than get the reduction by having it bundled in? I honestly think that's being extremely generous. It's probably closer to 5%, but let's be very, very generous and say 20%. So that would be, at a maximum, around 640,000 copies of Mario Kart sold worldwide, separately. And then a number smaller than that for Cyberpunk. Smaller still for Tears of the Kingdom, and even smaller for Breath of the Wild. So despite Piscatella's statement stopping at a top 3, Game Business tells us a little bit more. Quote, 62% of physical sales in the US were first party, not including Mario Kart World bundles. Holy crap. So yeah, we know that it's not including the bundle, as that's a physical game anyway. Physical sales. We'll get on to digital sales later, but 62% first-party physical is quite telling because there are barely any first-party physical games. We have Mario Kart, again, likely to have sold less than 640,000 copies. That is the absolute maximum, and it's quite possibly closer to 200,000. But let's be generous and say 640,000 copies. The only other first-party developed exclusive game is Switch 2 Welcome Tour. But A, that is not a real game, and B, it's digital only, so it doesn't count in that 62% of games being first-party. So we have the 2 Zelda games, re-releases of older games, and we know that they sold even worse than the physical Mario Kart and Cyberpunk, a third party. And for whatever reason, Piscatella decided to mask whether Breath of the Wild was 4th place or embarrassingly outsold by another third party. But if I had to guess, though, I'd say it was in 4th place, close behind Tears of the Kingdom. And the reason it's not being promoted heavily is that it actually looks better for the industry as a whole if we don't make it obvious that third parties aren't selling very well. So having a third-party game named in between Mario Kart and Zelda in the top 3 looks great. until you realize it's only the physical copies of Mario and Zelda, and both of them have reason to suspect that they didn't sell very well in reality. But other than that, what could be in that 62% of physical sales that were first party? Well, there's only one more title, Bravely Default. If that's even counted, we don't know whether they're counting that. We assume so, because Nintendo are publishing it. But it's not a Nintendo game, it's a Square Enix title that for some reason is published by Nintendo. Do we really think that Bravely Default 2 HD, whatever it is shifting hundreds of thousands of units at retail when it's a relatively niche RPG, JRPG, with hardly any name recognition, and it's an HD remake of an old 3DS title? Now, please don't get me wrong, I'm sure that it's a good game. I've heard some people raving about it, actually. But they were talking about how much they loved it many years ago on the 3DS. I can't imagine it's going to be a huge seller on the Switch 2, especially not at launch, where, don't forget, around 20% of people didn't even buy one single game. And that's counting digital sales too. I promised earlier that I'd cover why I think that is, so let's cover that next. I've already talked about how expensive the console is and how massively overpriced most of the accessories are, including many that parents would probably consider essential, in inverted commas, purchases when getting a system. So basically, at the time of buying, a decent amount of people aren't going to be able to afford a game. Parents will just assume that their kids' existing Switch 1 games will play on the system, like parents who may have bought a Game Boy Color or Game Boy Advance with no games back in the day so that little Timmy had a shiny new way to play his existing Pokemon games on a slightly nicer screen than his DMG or Pocket. As I said, it's not actually quite as simple as that when it comes to back compat, and we'll cover that later. But that's what Nintendo want people to assume with their misleading quotes. Plays backwards compatible Switch 1 games is a very weasel-worded quote that is purposely misleading. But again, there's a whole other video in that, and I don't think we can, afford the time to get completely distracted. So, by having such high prices, and in the case of at least the accessories, I'd argue unnecessarily high prices, Nintendo are reducing the amount of games that will be sold at launch. And that is perfectly okay by them. It's probably what they want, because actually, selling a carry case for $85, a mostly hollow second dock for $120, or something like the Joy-Con straps or wheels for $14 and $25 respectively, despite them being plastic with no electronics, they actually are making far more money from the accessories than the launch window sales. And they don't have to worry about shortages of memory chips or the tariffs on importing those memory chips. And they know that once you have bought the console, and some accessories presumably, you are bound to buy more first-party games, at least later on down the line. It's actually good business for them, one could argue, to sell less games at the start if they can upsell on accessories and charge higher for the console. But this is screwing over all third-party publishers. If Nintendo is purposely not caring about how many games are sold immediately, it's very damaging to the third parties, and it means that launch window sales for third parties are likely to be very low, and there is a genuine chance that some of the 25 launch titles sold close to 0 copies. Like the quote in the Game Business article said, despite strong hardware sales, the sales for one third-party company were, quote, beyond our lowest estimates. It's disastrous. But outside of the cost, or at least running alongside the problem of cost, why else would someone not buy any games for the system? Ignoring scalpers, because I've already laid into them, but perhaps nothing in the launch lineup interested them? but they bought a system with a pre-order because they were afraid of scarcity, and they knew there would be eventually games that they wanted. But it's a lot of money to spend just based on an assumption that you might want to use it in the future. And anyone who knows Nintendo history knows that it's quite often that Nintendo will suddenly drop the price of the console just 6 months later or so if it's not selling well enough. I think a far bigger factor is another thing that unfortunately is entirely Nintendo's fault and very confusing. It's the fact that, as I mentioned in both my Mario Kart review and my First Impressions console hardware review, Nintendo made the system and games completely unplayable without a day one patch, and therefore made it impossible for even the most trusted of journalists or reviewers to review any games in the first few days. Usually, anyone even vaguely connected to the games industry can get review copies at least a week early to give them a chance to get their reviews out in time for the public to be fully informed about what games are available to buy when they hit the shelves. But no. This time around, launch day comes, 25 games are available, and there are 0 reviews. And no one has played them beforehand, except for a handful of people very briefly trying demos for a few minutes at invite-only preview events held by Nintendo. And even that isn't enough for any of them to put out a review of any kind, just give quick first impressions. Even though I personally managed to get a Switch 2 console 3 days early, I couldn't actually play Mario Kart till launch day. And after 3 days of playing, I put up my detailed review, but very much review in inverted commas because I was still forming an opinion and hadn't had enough time to play every single thing thoroughly. And therefore, unlike my Fast Fusion review, the only other game that I've recorded an in-depth review for so far, rather than just a quick overview, I didn't feel comfortable giving it a review score. Pretty much every reputable website did exactly the same thing, ongoing reviews without an attached score. And this is for Mario Kart, the flagship game, the one that everybody had to cover extensively. So what chance did the 21 third-party titles have of getting any attention from any reviewers in this time span? It beggars belief. Now, you might argue that reviews don't matter, especially as the majority of those third-party games are actually already available on other systems, which, by the way, is another factor on why maybe they sold less, but we'll cover that later too. But in the case of the Switch 2, having games available on other systems really doesn't matter. What people would have wanted to know is, how do the games play on the Switch 2, especially given how poorly many third-party games ran on Switch 1. It's not surprising that people would want to wait to hear that a game actually runs well before putting down the cash, especially with the elevated prices of $60 or even $70 for many of the titles. As an aside, I think a perfect example of this is the trailer, again in inverted commas, for Hogwarts Legacy. In the absence of reviews for the game, Warner Bros. Interactive did the only thing that they could and made sure that 100% of footage available when you searched for the game online was literal split-screen comparisons between the Switch 1 and Switch 2 versions to show that, unlike the first time around, the game actually looks okay and runs pretty well. Of course, they should have offered an upgrade path of some kind for those that bought the pretty appalling Switch 1 version, but considering how low sales figures are for third-party games on the Switch 2, I almost can't blame Warner Bros. For wanting to make the best out of a bad situation and at least get some income from their investment and Avalanche's hard work in porting the game. So let's talk about those physical retail copies. In my deep dive into all 25 launch titles, I pointed out that out of all of the games physically available, only 2 third-party games are actually on the cartridge. Cyberpunk 2077 Ultimate Edition and Rune Factory Guardians of Azuma. Both games cost $70, which is pretty steep, more expensive than the expected third-party price of the last generation, but less than the $80 Nintendo is asking for Mario Kart or Tears of the Kingdom. And unlike those games, both Cyberpunk and Rune Factory include lovely packaging inside and out, color manuals and inserts, and aren't just empty boxes. I mentioned in both my Mario Kart review and the launch game lineups that Cyberpunk Physical Edition really puts Nintendo's own game to shame from a shelf collector value proposition sense. It's a really nice package. Now, I haven't bought it, and I didn't know too much about Rune Factory at the time I was making that video, so in my coverage I brushed over it fairly quickly, just mentioning that the developers should be commended for including the full game on the cartridge. But I had a really cool comment on one of my videos from a user on YouTube called Dialy. If you're listening, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. And they pointed out that Rune Factory Guardians of Azuma includes a 31-page full-color manual, quote, because they like their players. Yeah, quite. That's awesome. And by the way, I actually do read and try to respond to every comment that people leave, whether positive or negative, so please do drop a comment. I will try my best to shout out anyone whose information or opinion that leads me to mention something in a future video. In this case, Dialy helped cement the developers and publishers Marvelous as a good company to watch out for, in my mind. And a few days ago, I was compiling a spreadsheet of all forthcoming confirmed games so that I know what to cover and when. And I noticed that in the whole 98-game lineup, there were only 2 more third-party games coming out later this year, which are confirmed to have the full game on the physical cartridge. Daemon X Machina, Titanic Scion, which I'm pretty interested in as it's a sequel to a Switch exclusive that I thought was super stylish and had a lot of potential, and Story of Seasons Grand Bazaar, which I'm also very interested in because Story of Seasons is the new name for the true Harvest Moon games. There was some copyright hijinks, and the games that now use the name Harvest Moon aren't the real Harvest Moon, if that makes sense. Many people say that Story of Seasons games are actually the better titles and the ones that you should support. I haven't played Harvest Moon or Story of Seasons games since the SNES original, but I did love that game back in the day. And since I got into both Animal Crossing and Stardew Valley during and after the pandemic, I've been interested in dipping my toes back into the Harvest Moon series and seeing how it progressed nowadays. Of course, quickly learning that the best way to do this is with Story of Seasons, not the new games that are called Harvest Moon. And that's when I noticed both of those games are being published by Marvelous, the same company that published Rune Factory. Basically, out of every game confirmed for the first year of the system's life, the only third-party games confirmed to actually have the full game on the cartridge are Cyberpunk from CD Projekt Red and 3 titles published by Marvelous. So I did a little digging, and I found the co-founder of Marvelous, Ken Berry, being interviewed by Mikhail Madna for RPG Site, and he said that he plans all their games to be on physical ROM cartridges in the West because, and I quote, "This is the right decision for us and our relationship with our fanbase. As a, quote, combination of personal preference and long-term business strategy." He says, "If someone like me, who's been in the industry for half of my life, can't tell the difference on which cases contain the physical game or not, I can only imagine how much more difficult it is for a non-industry person, especially if they are purchasing as a gift for someone else. And I never want anyone to have buyer's remorse after purchasing one of our retail games." Thank you. Thank you. And just like that, the company has put itself on my map as perhaps the best third-party publisher on the system, and certainly one that I want to support. And if one or more of the titles they are releasing is interesting to you, I highly recommend that you do too. I was already interested in 2 of the games, and now I will be picking up all 3. And thanks again to Dialy for leaving a comment that helped me make this connection. Really cool stuff, and honestly quite inspiring to me as a game dev and indie publisher. This is the way that I want to be. I've been developing games since the 1980s, but in the 2000s, I basically left the industry completely as the types of games that I liked to make were no longer viable at the time. I like small solo dev or micro team passion projects, 90s aesthetics, pixel art, arcade-style gameplay, experimental and weird and wonderful ideas, unique narratives that say something, basically niche indie titles. For a while there, in the 2000s, that type of game couldn't really exist outside of Java mobile phone titles or Flash browser games, so I moved full-time into the film and TV side of the entertainment industry, rather than becoming just one in thousands of people making models or textures for a yearly Call of Duty game or something. No hate towards those in that industry, but I just personally couldn't get excited about that from a creative standpoint. I grew up in the days of bedroom programmers in the UK, working on the ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64 or Amstrad CPC, and where a spotty teenager like me could actually make the next #1 best-selling game before they'd even left school. And many of those people went on to form massive companies in the future that are still around now. Companies like Rare, Codemasters, or even Rockstar. But I got out of the industry until COVID kind of pulled me back in. I wasn't able to work on movies during lockdown for obvious reasons, and a good friend was streaming games every night on Twitch. Stardew Valley, Minecraft, and other games. And as we were hanging out, I was thinking, hey, these are cool, unique passion projects, basically made by one dude. And I got thinking about how there was a renewed market for high-quality 16-bit pixel art style games, and a collector's market for physical small print run editions for the Switch, and how cool it would be to make a game for a Nintendo system. I was specifically hyped for the Switch, as I want to put out physical games with really nice packaging, full color manuals, posters, maps, stickers, maybe even special editions with player's guides, figurines, keyrings, plushies, something that I personally as a collector would want to own and display proudly on my shelf. And it seemed to me that the Switch was the no-brainer system to do this with. Of course, retro collectors, people with a passion for 90s style games, pixel art, beautiful, highly displayable cover art, etc., gravitate towards limited edition Switch physical editions. And I wanted to do that for Switch too as well. But it's hard, man. It's really hard work. Not making the games. That's hard, obviously. But releasing the games for Switch 2 is far harder than it needs to be. Of course, I'm under NDAs, as are all devs, and also I don't want to rip into Nintendo and anger them and perhaps mean my games won't even get approved in the first place because they think I'm a negative person or harming their business. That's the opposite of what I want. I'm one of Nintendo's biggest supporters, and I have been for 3.5 frickin' decades. And the only reason I got back into game dev in the first place is specifically because I wanted to release on the latest Nintendo system. It's just, with Nintendo only offering the 64GB card variants currently, they are forcing third-party devs to increase their prices, or go the game keycard route, or digital only, or just skip Nintendo entirely and just release on Steam and PlayStation and Xbox, where replication of a Blu-ray is literally a matter of pence. I know this because I do it regularly for movies. And when margins are steep enough for third parties and to sell at a reasonable price, they will be making less royalties than they would on other consoles, including the original Switch. Nintendo is making it even harder to sell decent numbers by nickel and diming the consumer so they have less money to spend, and increasing both the expected price of a game and the minimum manufacturing costs so that a small indie weird niche game like the ones I make have to be sold at a price that might be too much to interest most people. My plan, since starting to develop all of my games, was for them to release digitally for somewhere in the $7 to $15 range, and then have limited print runs of really nice, elaborate physical editions for, say, $20 to $35, depending on how much stuff is included in the packaging. I actually think it's important that digital games should be cheaper than physical games. To me, that's a no-brainer. I don't understand why Nintendo is trying to push the standard of physical and digital being the same price. there's been plenty of people online who've at least rumored that Nintendo insists that you release at the same price. And again, I'm under NDAs, but if so, that's ridiculous. So yeah, what I think of as reasonable in my head for my games is $7 to $15 per digital, or physical copies for $20 to $35, depending on how much is in the package. And I think that's fairly standard. If you look at Switch 1 games, plenty of the smaller run editions, like, for example, limited run games or super rare games and things like that. Or I'm thinking like, the physical copies of things like Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge, for example. They sell for around about $30, which is great for a physical copy. So I would only really want to charge more than that for really elaborate things, like maybe a very small run by a Kickstarter or something like that of maybe $60 or $70 for a big cardboard box with a plushie, a figurine, a full player's game guide inside, that kind of thing. That's been my vision all along and what has inspired me to keep working on my games. Yeah, we can do, if you just want to play the game, you can get it really reasonably digitally. If you want a physical copy for the shelf, there's a reasonable price. And if you really want to go all out and support me, then I'm going to make damn sure that you have some really, really cool stuff. And it's very limited edition, so it's likely to go up in value in the future. That's the kind of prospect that I think is how at least smaller indie games should sell. And on Switch 1, in general, that has been the case. But Nintendo is making it very difficult to do that with Switch 2. I can't get excited about just a digital-only release. I'm a collector, and I know how much that I personally value physical games, so I would be a hypocrite to go the digital-only route. But a $20 to $35 physical release, while perfectly possible on Switch 1, is not just unprofitable, but basically impossible on Switch 2 with the current state of releases. To be fair to Nintendo, game key cards aren't as terrible an idea as many people think. I know, dislike, but hear me out. There are definitely use cases where they 100% make sense. For example, massive AAA titles that are bigger than 64GB or require being permanently installed onto the system anyway to run because of the faster read speeds being necessary. This is the case with many physical games on PS5 and Xbox Series right now already, so Nintendo is somewhat just following the industry trend. Can't say that I like it, but it is the way the industry is going. And as they tend to be the same price for the game keycards as the digital download, in a way, you're getting a box for free. And the option to resell your game, or at least the license to download and play it while servers exist, which is obviously better than just having the download. Game keycards aren't as good as a physical cartridge, but they are better than just a standard download, and they're the same price. So I understand why some people think you shouldn't complain. But I can't help but feel that Nintendo refusing smaller games to have smaller and therefore cheaper capacity cards, while simultaneously increasing prices across the board, both as a third-party developer and equally as a long-term passionate collector who predominantly chose the Switch as their modern system of choice because of the physical collection aspect, I can't help but feel that I'm being screwed over. And I'm far from the only one. Anyway, Matt Biscatella. Let's read this quote here. He's talking, of course, about the Switch 2 game sales being disastrous, worse than our lowest estimate, according to one third party. So Matt Piscatella says, third-party share in the US is far better than it was during the Switch launch. Third-party unit share of the Switch 2 physical software during week 1 reached just shy of 40%. For 1 month of the Switch launch, that's the first Switch, it was less than 20%. And then he goes on to say that it's basically too early and the sample size is too small to do a real analysis. I strongly disagree, and it's extremely disingenuous. And considering how experienced and educated this man is in the game industry and how long he's been at the very top echelons of the gaming industry, I think he knows that what he just said there is extremely misleading. And he's doing it on purpose for whatever reason. Is he a paid shill? Is he just worried about the state of the industry and he's trying to make things seem better than they are in order to stimulate the economy? I don't know what he's doing, but he's lying. He's lying by omission, and he knows it, because if he doesn't know it, then he's the worst video game analyst of all time. But I don't believe that for a second. I think he's an educated man who knows what he's talking about, and he's purposely lying by omission. I just don't know the reason why he is. But let's get into why. So what is he actually trying to say? He's trying to imply that it's a good thing that third-party games were 40% of the games that were sold. That's a good sign, and basically saying it's double the amount of third-party games that were sold on the Switch 1's launch, if you go by percentage. Okay. Let's look at the launch games for the Switch 1. The Switch 2 had a much better lineup with many more games, many more quality titles, and they aren't selling. The Switch 1, by the way, was not guaranteed to be a success. People forget it came off the back of the Wii U, and even the Wii before it, which both had been completely toxic to third parties. The only physical third-party games at Switch 1's launch lineup were Just Dance 2017, Just Dance, the series that everybody was playing on the Wii, and there was no reason to, buy a Wii U, let alone a Switch, to play Just Dance. Just Dance 2017, Skylanders Imaginators. Now, I've got nothing against Skylanders, but remember, that's the Toys to Life series where you pay a lot of money for a starter pack that comes with multiple plastic toys. Super Bomberman R. And then digital only, we also had I Am Setsuna, Shovel Knight, and Fast RMX. Shortly after, there was Snake Pass from Sumo Digital, which was kind of interesting. Nintendo only really had Snipper Clips and 1-2 Switch. So remember, we're talking here about the percentage of launch games which were third-party sales. So Nintendo had Snipper Clips and 1-2 Switch. Basically, it was a Breath of the Wild machine at launch, but Breath of the Wild was also available on Wii U. So the biggest exclusive from Nintendo was Snipper Clips and 1-2 Switch. Both small experiences, predominantly multiplayer, only kind of novelty experiences over very quickly. I like Snipper Clips, by the way, but it's not going to sell a console. And then Bomberman R, the third-party game, it became an excellent game over time, but it launched with a real kind of lack of content. And Bomberman is never a huge selling series, and the games are always very, very similar, so it is not a system seller or must-buy on day one. Now, Fast RMX was really the only game that was an exclusive system seller, in my opinion, just like Fast Fusion now is on Switch 2. By the way, check out my review for Fast Fusion and why that is really the king of the Switch 2 launch lineup games, in my opinion, especially as it's only $15. At the time, I remember I really wanted Snake Pass. It's kind of an interesting, rare-ish rare N64-ish looking platformer, but it's not really a platformer because you control a snake and he has to kind of wrap around things and hold on. But I didn't run out and buy a Switch specifically to play Snake Pass today. So what were people buying during the launch of the Switch 1? Firstly, the actual sales were almost nothing, except for Zelda Breath of the Wild. If you bought a Switch 1 on launch day, you bought it to play Zelda. You weren't buying it for 1-2 Switch or Just Dance or Skylanders. You know, if you wanted Just Dance or Skylanders, by the way, you were probably still playing on the Wii. You just skipped 2 generations. Bomberman, again, great game, but it's not a system seller. By the way, I feel like I skipped over Shovel Knight. I love Shovel Knight, but that was available on everything by that point. So it tells us absolutely nothing to say, oh, it was less than 20% of games were third party at the time. Yeah, that's because there was almost no games, and the only game that anybody cared about was Zelda. Right? That's not the case with the Switch 2 launch. The Switch 2 is the Switch. Look, the Switch 1 launched after the Wii U had been a colossal failure. Many people thought that the Switch 1 was going to fail. Many magazines, many websites, many industry analysts and experts were saying, oh, well, it might do a little bit better than the Wii U, but basically it's going to fail. It's not powerful enough. The battery life's not going to be good enough. It's too expensive. Zelda's available elsewhere, etc., etc. It's very different to the Switch 2. Everybody thought the Switch 2 was going to be a huge success out of the gate because the Switch 1 has been such a success. But the Switch 1 was not a guaranteed success at launch, and therefore there was almost no third parties releasing games for the Switch 1 at the start. Skylanders, Just Dance, Super Bomberman, Shovel Knight. These aren't games which are going to compare. They aren't system-selling games, especially as most of them are available elsewhere. And they're not games that are going to outsell Zelda, are they? Right? Switch 2 launch games, we've got major AAA games. Many of them. Too many to name. But they're selling very badly. They're really not selling. The only one that's really selling is Cyberpunk 2077, which is the second best-selling physical game. But it sold less copies than the physical copy of Mario Kart, and bear in mind that most people who would have bought the system got Mario Kart in with the bundle. So we can assume, we went over this in part 1 in more details, but we can assume significantly less than 600,000 copies. Significantly less. And that is for the best-selling third-party game. So, Piscatella, by comparing the launch of the Switch 1 and the Switch 2, with the implication being, well, look at what a big success the Switch 1 is, and the Switch 2 has sold twice as many. It's completely disingenuous because the Switch 1 was coming off the back of the Wii U and had almost no third parties and almost no major games, whereas the Switch 2 is coming off the back of the frickin' Switch 1 with 150 million units sold and every third party clamoring over themselves and many AAA huge experiences, and they're still not selling. I don't know. It's just, it's a boneheaded take. It's an absolutely boneheaded take. And it is purposefully simple, I believe, so that hoping that people forget that the Switch 1 was in such bad shape when it first launched. Because that's the only possible way you can read that as a good thing. If you look at it with context, it's a terrible thing. But he's saying it as if it's good. He's saying it as if it's, twice as many. It's not twice as many. It's a percentage that's twice as big. But a percentage of nothing is still nothing. You know? Anyway, that's beside the point. I'm going to stop ranting now. But Piscatella, got my eye on you. I know what you're doing. And the next big complaint that people will say when we start talking about, oh, these third-party games aren't selling, people will stereotypically turn around and say, people don't care about third-party games on Nintendo systems. Well, if you look at the digital sales from the launch window, it's actually only Mario Kart World and the Welcome Tour that made it into the top 16. And I only have figures for 16 because it's a combination of two top 10s. One that includes games with a physical release and one that doesn't. Anyway, interestingly, while people are buying the upgrades, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, the full games, aren't in there at all when it comes to full price digital releases. So people aren't buying them. People aren't paying that full price for the digital games. Everything else is third party. Everything else is third party. And what really stands out to me is that Deltarune, Fast Fusion and Ridge Racer are all there in the top 10. And they're basically the three cheapest games for the system, not counting Fortnite, which obviously is free to play, or Welcome Tour, which obviously isn't a game. The majority of the other best-selling games are all the ones which are $50 and under. The only more expensive games I can see are Cyberpunk and Nobunga, so yeah, price is a factor here, exactly as I said it would be. Many of these games are just too expensive for people to be able to afford right now, especially when they've just bought a very expensive console with even more expensive accessories. I also just don't think it's true that people who bought the Switch 2 don't care about third parties. I have received literally hundreds of comments on my channel, many of whom are from people that bought the Switch 2 and either bought third-party games or even only bought third-party games and don't care about first-party stuff. And out of all my videos on my channel, the ones covering third-party games often get just as many or even more views and likes than the ones covering first-party titles. Now, admittedly, I'm a very small channel, so that's not really a representative sample, but it's certainly not true that people buy Nintendo systems only for first-party games. Now, there were times in the past when that stereotype was definitely the case. For example, depending on generation, people who predominantly bought and played games for the Sega Genesis, PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, Xbox 360, but bought a SNES, an N64, GameCube, or a Wii as the secondary system during that generation that they only really got because they wanted a specific Nintendo game or games. The Switch really killed that notion and became many people's primary or only system, or the only console that they have to support their PC gaming. And that notion seems to be following the Switch too, at least for now. Let's see how the generation plays out. Do we even have console generations anymore, by the way? Both Sony and Microsoft seem to be trying to kill them, but we'll get onto that in a bit. By the way, on the subject of people leaving comments, my original plan was to quote and shout out many of the helpful comments from part 1 and elsewhere in this video, and I will do so in a few select cases, but in making my notes, I've already worked out that this is likely going to be my longest episode yet, but I really don't want to have to split it and make a part 3. I don't want to clickbait or drag things out more than necessary. I want to get on to positive stuff. But as for being positive, part 1 got picked up by YouTube's algorithm and went kind of viral, for my tiny channel at least, so I gained a whole bunch of subscribers in just a few days. So what I'm going to do is I'll do a 1,000 subscriber special. I'm not quite there yet, but keep leaving helpful comments and telling me all your experiences with or opinions about the Switch 2. And when we hit the first 1,000 on YouTube, if we hit, but fingers crossed, when we hit the first 1,000 on YouTube, we'll have a nice celebration and discussion. And if you're listening on Spotify, I read the comments there too. And the absolute best place, of course, is to come and join our absolutely free members area where you can chat to me, request topics to cover or games to review, and also take part in monthly free competitions where I give away free official Nintendo stuff just for fun. Just for fun. Comes out of my own pocket. It's not sponsored by Nintendo. I bought them myself and given them away. If you want to come join us for free or find other ways to support the show, it's linktree/dailyswitch2. That's linktr.ee/dailyswitch2. So another argument that people will give is, oh, the third-party games aren't selling well, but that's because these third-party titles are all old games. There's not very many exclusives. People might have already played these old games on other systems, or they know that they're available for cheaper elsewhere. But, I mean, I clickbaited RGT85 last time, and he made a good point. He said, what about Cyberpunk? Which he said is the oldest game. I mean, that's debatable because you have remakes of very old games, 3DS games, even a PS1 game with Suikoden. But even taking his point that it's an older game, so that negates the point because it is the best-selling third-party game, but it's also one of the oldest, if not the oldest. And I'd argue it's the game that people are buying to really push the system and show what it can do. And outside of that, Sega was the #1 third-party seller. Sonic, Yakuza, and Puyo Puyo Tetris. All of which, again, are re-releases of old games. But they were the #1 third-party seller. But also, taking that statement at face value of, well, these third-party titles are old games. Okay, but why? Why was it mostly old games at the launch? Because you've got to remember, we're looking at the analysis here and trying to work out what Nintendo's doing right and what Nintendo's doing wrong. So why were the majority of the third-party games old games? And also, why were some major publishers either not present or didn't give very much in the launch window? EA? Capcom? I mean, with Capcom, there's not even a logo for Switch 2 on Resident Evil 9's trailer, by the way. Question mark, was there a lack of dev kits? Were the dev kits not given out quickly enough? Was there difficulty getting them? Tony Goland from Ant Workshop says, Nintendo seemed to be prioritizing devs of games that need the extra power, in their opinion. Now, that would be fair enough if the Switch 2 was just an upgraded Switch 1. But we, as devs, can't guarantee backwards compatibility. Yeah, supposedly Unity, Unreal, and GameMaker have Switch 2 compatibility, but even Nintendo's own games are having weird issues, like Pikmin 3 hard-locking around once an hour. And, yeah, it's, again, can't break NDAs, but allegedly, anecdotally from other people, yeah, it's quite difficult to get hold of a Switch 2 dev kit right now. There's not enough to go around. Or Nintendo are being cagey about giving them out. And I don't know why they'd be doing that. But, you know, we can get on to Nintendo's opinions on third parties later. Because I have theories. But first we need to get into physical games in general. Are physical games dying? Because, again, that's something that many people are saying. And, you know, some people who just analyze the video games industry as a whole would say, it doesn't matter, physical games are dying, that's just the future, man, get on board the hype train for the future, you will own nothing and you will be happy. But many Nintendo fans, especially, like, I mean, the vast majority of my comments at least have been just absolute kickback, and it's not people who are angry, it's people who are distraught. Because Nintendo fans specifically care about physical games more than other fans, and we'll get on to why in a minute. But first, let's think about it from the perspective of other media. Now, I mention in basically every introduction that I work in the entertainment industry. Now, I've been programming games since the 80s, by the way, but just as a hobby to begin with. In the late 90s, I was in the music industry. Music industry was the first of the entertainment industries to go basically entirely digital. You had piracy, things like Napster and LimeWire, etc. And then Spotify obviously kind of made piracy in inverted commas legal. I know people will sit there and say, it's not piracy, I pay my subscription. Yeah, but if Spotify aren't paying the artists, you're still getting the music for free, right? Okay, technically you're not breaking the law, but you're getting the music for free. The artists aren't getting paid. But basically, these services trained people to think of music as being free, and we saw for a while that CDs and cassettes and everything else stopped appearing in shops, in retailers. But vinyl sales are going up, And they've actually started appearing in stores again, as actually have CDs, at least for big artists with big fan bases. And even indie artists sell a lot of CDs at gigs. They hang around afterwards and sell CDs and sign them for people. I've been to a few independent gigs recently, and after every single one, there was people lining up to buy CDs and have them signed. Myself included, by the way. So I moved out of the music industry because there was literally no money to be made anymore unless you were like super famous and you could use the music to advertise yourself and then make money from selling hair care products and makeup or selling your wedding photos to magazines. That's basically how most artists make their money. So using the connections that I'd made in the music industry and my goodwill, I moved slowly through kind of music videos and animations and commercials into working in movie production, basically low-budget films on DVD to begin with, and did very well for a while. But then the same thing happened. Internet speeds increased and people started pirating movies, just like they'd pirated songs and music, a few years before. And then again, just as Spotify kind of legalized piracy of music, Netflix basically legalized piracy of movies. And again, suddenly nobody bought DVDs anymore because you could pay a single subscription and you could get all your movies for free. So why would people buy movies on DVD? Nowadays, most people consume movies with streaming, and movies are seen as kind of more disposable. I heard Scott the Woz talking about this, and he said that people tend to get an emotional attachment to music, but not as many people get an emotional attachment to movies. I definitely do, but then it's my industry. And I can totally see that, how people will associate, a certain memory with a song, or they'll listen to a song over and over again, whereas even people who love movies might realistically only consume most movies once. So they're less likely to want to own a movie on DVD or Blu-ray. But streaming services have gotten worse. It was fine when it was just Netflix and it was a good price and a good service, but the service has got worse. The price has gone up, and it's not just Netflix anymore, is it? There's like 20 different streaming services or more. So people are slowly moving back to piracy, actually. But they're not really moving back to buying Blu-rays and DVDs, not the average person, sadly. Most stores have stopped selling Blu-ray and DVD, but there is a small but growing group of passionate movie fans that do collect them. Steelbooks, 4K Ultra, etc., especially if they collect a specific niche, like some people collect all the superhero movies, some people collect B-movie horrors, etc. And that's great for me because I produce a lot of B-movie horrors, and nowadays I produce some superhero movies as well. Sorry for those people who hate superhero movies and think there's too many of them. Hopefully the ones that I produce are a little bit different, but that's not to be said in this episode. Otherwise I will talk for even longer on a tangent that's not related. So that's movies and music. I suppose you could talk about how books have kind of gone digital, sort of, but I think a lot of people do like collecting physical books, myself included. I've got a ever-growing library, but less and less people are reading nowadays. They're just watching their TikToks and stuff. So yeah, books are a dying breed as well. But as far as video games go, physical video games, well, PC has basically been digital only since Steam took off, and also Epic Store and GOG and everything else. But basically the PC market is Steam, isn't it? And I do definitely miss physical PC games, especially the big box physical PC games. They were always really cool, weren't they? Like you got on DOS, and back in the day, the kind of personal computer games that came in the big boxes as well, like the Amiga or the Atari ST. There was something so cool about them, and often they'd come with like little tchotchkes inside the box as well. And that's something that I want to bring back, by the way, with my own games. My own games that I develop will have physical PC versions. Both a standard version that's just on a DVD or a Blu-ray in a normal case, if you want to put that with the ones that will match. But also I want to put out some of those big box titles and fill it with all kinds of really cool stuff for people who do want that from a collectible standpoint. But that's only really going to appeal to people who were around in the 80s and 90s and remember them and maybe collect them now, like people like Metal Jesus Rocks and stuff, you know, and Clint from LGR and stuff. There is a percentage of people who just really like those big boxes. Well, I want to bring that back. But it's never going to be a major market, is it? And also, I'm aware that many people who play games on a PC nowadays don't have an optical disc drive. They don't even have like a Blu-ray drive or anything on their PC or in their laptop. Yeah, with the collector's editions, I want to put out some nice kind of custom-shaped, cool flash drives for those that want them. So again, it's not just a code in a box. There will actually be a custom, cool little flash drive that you can plug into a USB, and it will have the game on there as well. Because again, I don't really like the idea of code in a box or key cards. If I'm charging money for something physical, I don't want it to actually have the game there. It really annoys me nowadays when, you know, big elaborate collector's editions of games don't actually come with the game. It's just so annoying. I remember when Sonic Mania came out, I was so hyped for Sonic Mania, and still, I mean, to me, that is an incredible game. 10 out of 10, almost no notes. I just wish that Amy Rose was included in it. They added, you know, Ray and Mighty before they added Amy. That's a bit sus. I like Ray and Mighty, nothing against them, but why can't Amy play along? Getting into my fan bias there, but yeah, that was the first and possibly only collector's edition that I've ever bought which didn't actually come with the game. But that's at the time we thought there wasn't going to be a physical edition of the game. But thankfully we did eventually get a really nice physical edition of the game as well. So that's now sat happily on the shelf. But obviously Sonic Mania is a console game as well. But basically with those big box games, I'm talking about the PC and the PC being digital only. But even back in the retro days, there was a precedent for digital games. Like PC always had shareware, etc. Back in the day, like the most successful PC game of all time is arguably Doom, and that started off as shareware without a physical copy. And if you wanted a physical copy, it wasn't in the shops to begin with. You actually had to, you know, write a letter and send a check through the mail, and then Romero and Co. would send you back floppy disks. I actually talked on Reddit last year about my experience as a game developer in the 1980s and learning to code, my dad teaching me to code, and John Romero actually very kindly somehow he saw my post. I don't know how he saw my post, and he liked it, and he gave it an award, and he donated, and it was crazy. I was like, wow, okay. And then some of the other guys from id Software jumped on as well, and it was just, that was very overwhelming for me because, wow, what an inspiration Doom was and is to me as a developer. It's one of my favorite games of all time. But something about my story of learning to be a game dev in the 80s with my dad, and it touched him somehow, which is lovely. But nowadays, of course, the shareware back then, that was in a time when not everybody had an internet connection. Nowadays, it's just a given. If you have a laptop, a PC, a Steam Deck, an internet connectivity is a given. So basically, yeah, almost 100% of the PC market is digital and has been for a long time. But the appeal with consoles specifically, was always previously that they're just plug and play. Simple for kids, simple for parents. You don't have to worry about specs. You don't have to worry about installation. You don't have to worry about making boot disks and config sys and auto-exec bat. I'm showing my age now. Consoles. Think about like the NES, the Genesis, even the PS2. You put your game in, you press the power button, you play the game. That should be the way that consoles are. And for the majority of Nintendo Switch 1 games, that's how they are. Now, Xbox have been arguably trying to push for a digital-only, always-online future since that disastrous unveiling of the Xbox One. But after initially backtracking because they had to, there was outcry, their plan has basically come into fruition anyway by stealth. Game Pass, when it started, was such a good deal that now we're left with everything is an Xbox. in inverted commas, and it's very unlikely that we'll get another real console generation from Xbox, and if we do, it sure as heck ain't having a disk drive. Just like the 50% of PS5s where the digital-only version were cheaper, in inverted commas, while meaning you can't get reduced-price games, you can't buy second-hand games, you can't buy things out the bargain bins in retail shops. So, okay, you saved yourself, what was it, $50? Maybe 100? I think it was 50. But your games are going to be more expensive, guaranteed now. And that was 50% of PS5s, but 100% of PS5 Pros. PS5 Pro doesn't even come with a disc drive. You can buy one separately in theory, but they're expensive and they are hard to come by, and they were released in a limited amount. And by the way, that disc drive requires an internet connection to install it, which renders it completely useless once the servers are no longer up. In my Switch 2 hardware review, I talked about the Switch Day 1 patch causing exactly the same problem, and how even comparatively new hardware that you can still find in certain retail stores selling brand new and sealed no longer work. Like the Oculus Go, which can't get past the safety videos when you boot it up for the first time, unless you get into downloading Android APKs and the like. Try and get the grandma to work out how to do that so that little Timmy can play on his new thing that she saw in the shop window and thought looked cool. This is the future that we live in, folks. Nothing lasts forever, but some things don't last as long as it takes for the shops to clear their stockroom. Hell, some supermarkets have Concord for PS5 on the shelves still because they didn't get the note that Sony took down the servers. What was it, like 2 weeks after release? It's nuts. Now, anecdotally, from the developers and publishers that I speak to, and from my experience, more PS4 physical copies than PS5, certainly for the kind of indie retro style games that I make. But there definitely are still physical collectors for the PS5. It barely exists on Xbox. Even their major console exclusives often don't get physical releases. Like Gears 5, like 5 years ago. Does Halo Infinite have a physical copy? Probably, but I've never seen one. And if it does exist, there'll be nothing on the disc, just a license to download it. Same with like Indiana Jones, although that's not even system exclusive, is it? And the fact that I'm struggling to think of more than 3 examples in the last 5 years should tell you all you need to know. Nintendo, though, was always the holdout. People still collect physical carts for NES, SNES, Game Boy, N64, and they still work to this day. We're all blowing in them, even though we know we aren't supposed to, because it does make them work. The Switch 1 kind of became the new Vita as far as small print runs for indie games. It became the vinyl collectors, the 4K Blu-ray Steelbook enthusiasts. And Nintendo is trying to kill that market. Why? Well, maybe Nintendo does want the physical market to die. The Switch 2 is heralded by the new guard, a new team, much younger, hasn't grown up with physical collecting and stuck in the past, following the lead of the biggest and best players in the market, especially looking to the West. Per sale, Nintendo keeps 100% of the profit of digital sales and doesn't even have to share with anyone. No third-party manufacturers, no retailers, either physical or online, no digital storefronts except their own. The only person that gets the cut is a third-party developer, but even then it's a walled garden. Nintendo can choose how much to pay them, or even if they're allowed to sell at all, and once listed, whether to promote that game or bury it. Nintendo want control and power, and that's why Nintendo wants digital games to be the same price as physical. Because they don't want any reason for people to buy the physical games instead of the digital ones, but they also know that they get 100% of the sale, or minus the third-party royalty, I suppose, but in general, 100% of the sale. So of course they want to sell it for full price. Why wouldn't they? Historically, secretly Nintendo don't seem to really like it when third parties are successful, even if they actually need them. Look at the N64, for example. It was dying, and then kept afloat almost entirely by Rare coming in and stepping up their game. A Western third-party developer regularly releasing the games that made people want to buy the console, to the fact that their games started being packed in with the console when people bought them. But Nintendo refused to buy Rare, and Microsoft eventually bought them instead. Now, that would have been like if Disney allowed Pixar to be bought by DreamWorks. Because don't forget, when Pixar started, they weren't Disney. When they were making Toy Story and Bug's Life and Finding Nemo, they didn't belong to Disney. They were an independent company, and then Disney used to distribute their movies on a movie-by-movie basis. But Disney were making more money from Pixar movies than they were their own animated movies for a period. So if they'd have allowed, say, DreamWorks or Blue Sky or Sony to come along and buy Pixar because they're like, nah, we don't need it. We can make our own animated movies. It's just boneheaded. It's boneheaded. Of course you buy them. And Nintendo should have bought Rare, but they didn't. But third parties have never been a priority for Nintendo. There was terrible treatment of third parties in the days of the NES. There was big success for third parties, especially people like Capcom and Konami on the NES. But they treated third parties really badly, to the point that there was massive antitrust lawsuits and anti-competitive lawsuits in America. And then on SNES, N64, GameCube, Wii, and Wii U, they had massive problems with third parties, and they didn't really seem to care or try and fix any of the problems that they had. The Switch 1 was the turnaround, and the Switch 1 has made them the most money out of any of their consoles ever by a huge margin, and a huge percentage of that is software sales. But they want to think that that was done only by their first-party games. Now, admittedly, on the Switch 1 at least, we do have a ton of excellent first-party games, and they were released very, very regularly, an absolute richness. Perhaps the best first-party lineup for any Nintendo console ever, certainly the most, and released the most often. There was points where an excellent first-party game for the Nintendo Switch was released every month or two, but that's partially because it's the longest-lasting console, supported by all these other third parties on the market, and partially because they had all the excellent first-party games from the Wii U, which they could just repackage and re-release as if they were brand new games, because nobody bought a Wii U except me and the absolute hardcore. They don't have that luxury now. A game like Donkey Kong Bonanza, for example, looks absolutely incredible, but how often can a game like that realistically be released? Mario Kart World and Metroid Prime 4 both started development well over 5 years ago and were planned as Switch 1 games. So sure, Nintendo has big franchises: Mario, Zelda, Pokemon, Smash Brothers, Splatoon, Animal Crossing, Metroid, Pikmin, Star Fox, F-Zero, yada yada. That's Kirby if you count HAL Laboratories second party. That's not sustainable, though, to release a high-quality title in all those series every 3 months or so. Most only get one game per generation, or even less. Some of those franchises haven't even had a game in the last generation, or two. They need big third-party releases too, otherwise it's going to feel like there aren't very many good games being released for the Switch 2, and given the expensive price of the console and those games, people just aren't going to jump on board, or they're at least going to wait and hope for a price drop and wait until there's more games that they want to buy. So the Switch 1 was uniquely good for collectors and third parties and indie games. Why is that? Well, Nintendo has a much, much longer history than the PlayStation. First PlayStation was in 1994, and that's not even getting into the fact that PlayStation started off as a Nintendo brand. I was actually requested to make a spin-off episode about that, and I definitely will do. We just need to get all this time-sensitive stuff out of the way first. And especially Xbox as a brand has only been around since 2001. They essentially took over when Sega's hardware business died after the Dreamcast. Don't forget, Microsoft were very heavily involved with the Dreamcast, and were considering buying Sega at one point. Nintendo started producing home consoles long before the Xbox in 2001 or the PlayStation in 1994. The first home console from Nintendo was 1977 with the Color TV Game 6, and then the 15, and then the Racing 112, and Block Breaker, and the Othello one, whatever that one was called. And then, of course, the Famicom in 1983, which became the NES, released in the West soon after. Even before they made consoles, though, Nintendo made physical collectible items, playing cards, toys, mechanical games. There has always been a concept of owning a Nintendo thing, and the logo on a product is usually a sign of a certain quality, and the Nintendo seal of quality, so to speak. Xbox and PlayStation as brands, when we look at their marketing, have literally always been tech forward rather than legacy forward. And that makes sense because they are newer brands that had to establish themselves in an existing market. And it's also a key part of their brand identity to be pushing the latest tech, the latest graphics, the coolest, most fashionable thing. So looking back isn't a thing that they often do. And you notice it's only when they start floundering that they do rely on that sometimes. Like, for example, the PS5 wasn't selling very well, didn't have very many exclusive games. Most of the games that people wanted were available on the PS4. People weren't jumping in and buying a PS5 right away. So what do? They release a grey one with a PlayStation 1 logo on it, and suddenly a load of collectors come out of the woodwork and say, okay, now's the time when I'm going to buy a PS5. And I know multiple people who did that, by the way, and I was sorely tempted myself. Now, even though Nintendo wants to appeal to cool adults as well as children, they have a family-friendly approach, and their market appeal when advertising directly towards older gamers who aren't parents often revolves around nostalgia for the times playing their games when you were young, or refinding parts of yourself from your childhood that you lost as you became old and cynical. Therefore, a bit like Disney adults, and by the way, I could probably be described as a Disney adult, apologies, the most passionate of Nintendo's older fans associate Nintendo as something to collect and display. Nintendo has always been a toy brand, and it feeds into the modern aspect of adults collecting figurines, wearing brand t-shirts, collector's editions of games, etc. The adults that like to buy and display toys in inverted commas because they're collectibles. And again, that applies to me. I'm not being snarky. That's not to say that Sony or Microsoft don't have that aspect too. I, for example, personally collect Parappa the Rapper items. But it's not the biggest and most profitable part of their business. It's the mainstream titles like FIFA, Call of Duty, etc., which essentially become worthless once the latest and greatest title is released. Even the big AAA single-player titles like Last of Us, Tsushima, Uncharted, etc., they're seen as more temporary, like blockbuster movies, than collectible treasures that you'll still be playing in 20 years' time and might be worth something if you keep a sealed copy, like with Nintendo games. And as for indie games, that focus for Nintendo players wanting physical is 10 times more the case, especially if they are retro-styled titles that will specifically appeal to the people who still worship the NES, SNES, Game Boy, and N64 titles and like to collect and display them. Now, sure, Steam on the PC will always be the first place that most indie titles make it big, but once they become a cult classic, fans want a physical version to put on their shelf. It's a Switch cartridge they want. Baby, it's the whole reason companies like Limited Run and Super Rare, etc. exist, and they were so successful that now I know of at least 40 similar companies putting out short runs of small indie games on the Switch. And some developers even decide to publish their own games and finance runs of physical Switch carts via Kickstarter or with existing revenue from their digital sales. And this was all made possible because, one, after the Wii U spectacularly failed, and almost all third parties quickly jumped ship, Nintendo was desperate for games and basically let almost anyone develop games, mobile titles, asset flips, students' first games, etc. for the Switch 1. Now that led to a lot of rubbish, but it also led to some really amazing gems of indie titles being there if you could sort through the rubbish. And again, that's kind of what the physical copies exist for. If it's got a physical copy, it's probably worth playing. 2. The large market existed for Nintendo fans already being used to collecting and displaying physical games, like the aforementioned NES cartridges, and even seeing them as a future investment, especially games with short print runs, like the limited runs, etc. People might think, for example, of Shantae on the Game Boy Color as an example of a very valuable title to own because not very many copies of it were produced. And 3, the Switch 1 game cartridges are extremely affordable, even down to the point that an individual person who programs a Switch game in their bedroom could potentially take out a loan and finance a small print run of their Switch 1 title to sell to their fans on social media, especially for indie and retro games which tend to not need very much storage, so they can use the cheaper cartridge sizes. So let's get on to cartridge sizes then. I'm guessing even the non-techie people out there are aware of SD cards that you have to put inside your camera or to expand your storage of your phone, if you're lucky enough to have a phone that takes SD cards nowadays. And you'll know that they come in different sizes, or you'll know that your iPhone comes in different sizes of gigabytes or whatever, right? Okay, so the Switch 1 cartridges. When the Switch 1 launched, you could get a 1 gigabyte cartridge. That's very small. It was rarely used. It was mostly for very small indie titles. I remember Spelunky, for example. A 2 gigabyte cartridge, slightly more common in third-party and indie releases. But eventually both of those disappeared because there was a 4 gigabyte cartridge, which is frequently used for kind of standard-sized games. And then as the price of storage became cheaper and cheaper, the price of cartridges became cheaper and cheaper. The 1 gigabyte, 2 gigabyte kind of weren't needed anymore. So 4 gigabyte tends to be the standard small cartridge size. And, almost all small indie games will fit on a 4 gigabyte cartridge, especially like pixel art titles and stuff like that. 8 gigabyte exists as a variation. Again, it's common for most kind of mid-sized to larger games. And then 16 gigabyte is used for more complex or higher resolution graphics games, high resolution textures needed for 3D stuff. Basically, any kind of AAA-ish third-party game from a big publisher, that will be on a 16 gigabyte cartridge. And they also had a 32 gigabyte cartridge, which is available but expensive and very rarely used. The one that springs to mind is Witcher 3. Came on a 32 gigabyte cartridge, and we'll get to that later because, of course, there's that CD Projekt Red through line. But basically, most third-party games, if they're small little indie games, they would come on a 4 gigabyte or an 8 gigabyte cart. And most kind of AAA-ish games would come on a 16 gigabyte cart. But if it was needed, there was a 32 gigabyte variant, but it would cost devs a bit more. There was a 64 gigabyte cart for the Switch 1 announced and tested, but never actually released. And of course now, that very same cart is being used on the Switch too. Now, there is some crossover with the whole game keycard thing, because as I said, many AAA games use the 16 gigabyte card because it's, the most affordable of the larger sizes. But then they require a download for something bigger, like I remember Mortal Kombat 11, LA Noire, various games that don't contain the entire game on the cartridge. Or something like the Grand Theft Auto Trilogy only actually includes GTA 3 on the cartridge and then require a download for Vice City and San Andreas, things like that. So the whole game keycard not having the game on the cartridge is not 100% new like people seem to think. There are third-party games which aren't on the cartridge, then says, oh, you have to download this or you have to download that. I think the reason why people are getting so up in arms about this is because it's predominantly not people who collect the AAA multi-plat games that are available on everything that care. It's the people that collect those kind of short-run indie titles, pixel art retro style games, or kind of weird, more esoteric. There's not going to be very many of them, so you buy them as an investment thing. Anime games, RPGs, those are the kind of things that the real diehard physical collectors gravitated towards the Switch 1 for. So the cartridges themselves then, 1GB, 2GB don't really exist anymore, but 4GB, 8GB, 16 or 32, those cartridges, they aren't just SD cards in a proprietary shape, but they do use flash memory similar to an SD card, but non-volatile on custom ASIC modules, developed with megachips and manufactured by Macronix. They are rated to last over 20 years at 85 degrees C. They're not quite as robust as something like an NES cartridge, but they're pretty damn robust. Inside the cartridge, there's also a separate security/authentication chip. It's integrated and it does some decryption as well. And there's obviously an eMMC interface to connect to the console. And a proprietary but very simple kind of SPI-like 8-bit game memory interface for accessing the flash chip. Now, if most of that doesn't make sense to you, basically what it means is it's like a flash card, but there's like a encrypted proprietary way that flash memory then talks to the console, so you can't easily pirate games for it. The new Switch 2 chips in the Switch 2 carts are essentially just a higher capacity version of the same tech made by the same companies, likely built on 3D RAND. But as we said, they were actually originally developed to be used on Switch 1, but just deemed too expensive to be practical. It's absolutely possible that someone could release a 64GB cartridge for the Switch 1 if Nintendo actually allowed it. The tech is cross-compatible. It's basically the same. They prioritize higher capacity and not speed. Any speed increase from the card itself is negotiable, if at all. They do read faster, yes, but that's because of the Switch 2's I/O hardware and not the carts themselves. The Switch 1 cartridges also read significantly quicker on the Switch 2, and loading times of games that stream from the cart or bulk dump to RAM from the cart are noticeably faster when running a Switch 1 cartridge on the Switch 2. Again, it is the console that is faster and not the cartridges themselves. The 64GB variants aren't really doing anything particularly special. They're just red plastic and have a number 2 on them. The game keycards are different in that they contain no true flash storage, just an EEPROM similar to what you have in an NFC, like Amiibos. Typically, those would only be 512 bytes to 8 kilobytes and used just to store the license code or web link to an online server. Now, I haven't done a teardown myself, and even if I did, I don't really have the equipment like the special microscopes to properly examine them. So I may be wrong about all that, but honestly, I don't think I am. And if a tech expert can point me towards an article that comfortably disproves what I just said, I will happily add a correction in the pinned comments. But from my own experiments as a dev myself and a hardware enthusiast, and from what Nintendo have officially said themselves over the years, I'm pretty certain that I'm right. So what does this mean for Switch 2 games? Well, if you are releasing a AAA third-party game, which Nintendo does actually need to attract the mass market and prove that the tech is powerful and can compete with PlayStation and Xbox to some extent, then you do have 64GB, which is just about enough to contain the average third-party game. That's between 50 and 60GB. We covered that in our statistics analyzing section of the launch lineup episode. And I also split it up into clips. It's the one with Mario Scrooge McDuck diving into his riches and Majika with the crystal ball. Life is like a hurricane here in Nintendo Land. This works perfectly for something like Cyberpunk 2077, which, despite being third-party, is the second biggest selling game of the launch titles, as we said. The disadvantage is exactly the same problem that Nintendo had before when testing the 64GB cartridges on the Switch 1. They are very expensive. Yes, I'm a developer, but I'm not breaking NDAs because it's already leaked by NIS America that the charge per unit for third-party publisher, even in bulk, is $17 or thereabouts. So this raises the average cost of a game and or reduces the amount of profit per game sold. If they want to avoid either charging more or making less money, then they can go with a game keycard instead. And that is what every third party so far, and for the rest of the year's confirmed releases, has decided to do, except for CD Projekt Red, Marvelous, and Bandai Namco with one of their titles. There's also, obviously, the factor that some AAA games are larger than 64GB. It's not unheard of for a AAA game nowadays to require a 100GB download on PC, for example, which, in my opinion, as somebody who literally started my development career on systems where I had to work hard to fit my code into 16KB, and then when I finally got an upgrade to 64KB system, it felt like a huge luxury. The lack of optimization there at 100GB for a game is ridiculous. I get it that modern AAA games often require higher and higher fidelity and more voice acting, video clips, etc. But it's simply not a good user experience to have them buy a game, especially a console game, and then have to wait hours before it will even boot. That's what consoles were supposed to avoid, like I said earlier. Plug in a cart or insert an optical disc and it just works right away. Sadly, those days are mostly gone, but people do still expect that from Nintendo. And that has been the case for the majority of Switch games until now. Like the owner of Marvelous Games, who we quoted in our last part, said, it's confusing and upsetting for consumers. Many parents and grandparents won't understand why they bought a Nintendo game, handed it to their child, and it doesn't work, in inverted commas. It's not a good look for a large part of their core fan base who has been around for decades and expects it to work a certain way, and it no longer does. But this problem, in inverted commas, of either more expensive games or games requiring a large download before working simply doesn't need to exist for many games. It's a false limitation imposed by Nintendo that actually defies all logic. For smaller games that could fit on them, there is no reason why the same 4, 8, 16 and 32GB Macronic cards being used on Switch 1 games can't be put in red plastic and used for Switch 2 games, even if those games are exclusive for the Switch 2. There is zero reason, other than Nintendo don't want to. It's the same tech. Why wouldn't they want to? Well, because, as we said, Nintendo want to nudge consumers not so subtly towards going digital only, because they make much more money from a digital sale at full price than they do if they have to share it with retailers, etc. They knew that there would be outcry about $80 Mario Kart, and they did that on purpose so that they could make the bundle $30 cheaper to make it seem like a bargain by comparison, even though the console itself is quite expensive. But it only contains a download for the game and not the physical cartridge. So your very first experience of the system is likely with a digital download game. You learn the process to get comfortable with it, especially a parent or a grandparent who's just bought that console as a present and is helping the child set it up. They learn the process of, oh, I have to download the game. That's unusual. It didn't used to be like that, but now they know what to do. And you get used to the convenience of having the game there on the console whenever you want it without needing to find the cartridge. They're hoping to train consumers out of thinking of Nintendo as being a physical collectible, because if they succeed to not lose their customers but instead retrain them, it's far more profitable and they retain more control. But I think that they vastly underestimated how much this affects how many of their customers. If you follow the whole history of Nintendo's console releases, there have been very high highs, but they've also nearly had to drop out of the home console market entirely several times. And the two things that saved them, time and time again, were their handheld division, specifically Pokemon, and the true hardcore shelf collectors, who even in times of trouble buy every new minor re-release, hardware refresh and color variety that they release. Guilty as charged. Sorry, it's my fault. In fact, there is actually a lot of crossover there. A large amount of the biggest Pokemon enthusiasts buy both or even all three releases of every mainline game. Red, blue, yellow, etc. And many of them also collect every new Pokemon-themed console release, Pokemon-themed joypads, etc. Again, going back to Nintendo's roots of making physical playing cards and toys, Pokemon is a franchise that mostly succeeds because its fans want to collect physical stuff. Cards, plushies, toys, gotta catch 'em all. It's the whole appeal. But it's the same with Zelda fans also. Having financial difficulties and the mainstream gamers aren't buying your console, just re-release an old Zelda game with an HD upscale and package it with a brand new, mildly Zelda-themed console that you call limited edition because you put a sticker on it and painted it. But you make millions of them, even though you say it's limited edition, and fans will not only re-buy a game that they already own and have played a million times, but they will buy a whole new console or handheld despite already buying the original day one. When the original Game Boy stopped selling, but they weren't ready to release the next model, we got the Play It Loud color variants. When the N64 was floundering again because we didn't have enough third-party games, we got the Fantastic models, etc., etc. Many fans collected all of them. When you see them proudly displayed behind every YouTuber and streamer, it's like a rite of passage if you're a Nintendo collector to prove your worth. How many different Game Boys do you have? How many different versions of the Switch did you buy? The Switch one was an enormous success, almost entirely due to this collector's impulse. When PlayStation and Xbox pivoted to being digital only, and even the Blu-ray version stopped having the games on the actual disc, and yes, I do know that, by the way, I've had a million people point that out in the comments. I did actually mention it, but a lot of people leave comments without listening to the whole video. I understand, I talk a lot. It's fine if you don't listen all the way through. Thank you for watching, I'm not complaining. But even the Blu-ray version stopped having the games on the disc, and collectors of physical media just went all in on the Switch at that point. Third parties, especially smaller, more niche developers, went all in too, and it was a match made in heaven. Despite the console selling over 150 million units, there are likely no more than 50 million unique users. So that means a large amount of consumers bought 3, 4 or more console varieties. Perhaps the Switch Lite and OLED, but I'm going to bet that many bought Zelda, Animal Crossing, Mario variants of the console. These are people who are either buying as future investments or because they want to display them proudly on the shelf. And many of those will not want to display a game keycard or a code in a box. And if they eventually feel forced to go digital only and not have anything physical at all, they'll just stop caring about collecting entirely. It's an entirely different mindset to gaming. Game collecting and gaming are not the same thing. There's crossover, but they're not the same. And Nintendo predominantly sells to collectors, and a lot of their collectors don't play everything that they collect. Nintendo are currently chasing the casual hardcore market, especially the Western ones, i.e. the people that want to play Call of Duty, FIFA, Madden, Fortnite. Those guys are not going to suddenly shift allegiance from the PlayStation, Xbox, or PC to Nintendo. It's just not the same brand appeal. It's a different demographic entirely. And if any of those people want to play digital games portably, they're more likely to buy a Steam Deck or a ROG Ally like the upcoming Xbox branded one. Digital-only games will always be cheaper on Windows and Linux-based systems, and newer, more powerful tech can be released every few months with companies like that. Nintendo just can't compete there. It's not their strength. Now, some people might think, well, maybe there's valid excuses for Nintendo phasing out the smaller capacity cards. Well, maybe if Macronics have let them know that they plan on stopping production of smaller capacities. But that doesn't seem to be the case, and they only did before when the costs came down for the higher capacities, like the 1 and 2 gigabyte sizes being kind of shelved when the 4 gigabyte became cheaper, so the smaller ones weren't needed. It will be interesting to see if Nintendo's own first-party games always come on 64 gigabyte cards, even when they don't even slightly need to, just to be stubborn. It's interesting that Drag X Drive is a first-party Nintendo game that they're pushing quite heavily, but it's only 1.8 gigabyte and they want to release it at a $20 budget price, so they're going digital only. I think that game will sadly get buried, and if they made it a physical release for $30 or even $40, a lot more core fans would be interested in picking it up. And if they would allow themselves, they could put it on a 4 gigabyte cart and make a lot more money per unit sold. But are they just going to be stubborn and say, well, we don't want to put it on a 64 gigabyte card, it would be too expensive, so we're just going to make it digital only, and a lot of our core fans won't end up getting the game? I don't know. But Nintendo are a rule unto themselves. They don't always seem to make logical sense, but what do we know? We are mere mortals. But me as a mere mortal and third-party dev, what options are there for third-party devs and publishers who want to release physically right now on the Nintendo Switch 2? Okay, now this could change, and I hope it does. I genuinely hope it does. That's one of the reasons that I'm making these videos. I'm not just complaining for the sake of it. I will offer some solutions towards the end of the video, just in case anybody at Nintendo happens to hear this. They won't, but just in case. 1. Your first option, release on a 64 gigabyte cartridge. Even if your game would have fitted on a much smaller capacity card, they don't allow it. It seems wasteful from an environmental perspective, and it costs up to $17 more than necessary, but you will get a boost from the people that want to collect only physical cards. As I said, only 3 publishers out of every single confirmed game for this year seemed to have chosen to do that. And only Bandai Namco would have managed to do it at a reasonable price, $50 instead of $70 for the others. Kudos to them, but it was for a mini-game compilation mostly aimed at children. I don't think the market would have allowed for a higher price. Nor would parents want a little kids game that requires an internet connection and won't instantly boot, so perhaps they kind of felt forced to, because their only other announced release so far is a more adult-themed game, and that comes on a code in a box, albeit at the relative bargain price of $30. We'll get to that later. The second option then is to release a Switch 1 version for physical collectors, and then either a game keycard, a code in a box, or a digital only for Switch 2, but offer a free or very cheap upgrade for people that own the Switch 1 cart but want to play on Switch 2. This seems like a good solution, and it's one that many publishers are going for. But it's not ideal because, as we discussed in part 1, once someone puts a lot of money into buying a new console, they typically lose all interest in buying new games for the old system. Last part, I used the episode of Yoshi and Pooch's Woolly World on the 3DS, releasing after Switch 1 had released, for example. The Switch 2 is an expensive console, but every new Switch game bought by a consumer after buying the console makes them feel like it was a worthwhile investment. But buying a Switch 1 game might make them feel that they've wasted their money on the Switch 2 if they're still buying games for the older system. They want that nice new Switch 2 packaging on their shelf to see their growing collection. And at the moment, that's basically the only 2 options. There are others that would be possible in theory, but at the moment Nintendo don't allow them. We'll get to that later. But first, here's something I didn't predict would happen, but I really should have. It looks like Nintendo might be trying to discourage people from releasing games on Switch 1 and encouraging Switch 2 players to buy an upgrade. In the last day or two, Nintendo of Canada have put out a statement warning that Switch 1 prices will be raising. The hardware, the physical games, and even the digital games. Here's the quote. Pricing for the original Nintendo Switch family of systems and products will change based on market conditions. These include Nintendo Switch, OLED model, Nintendo Switch Lite, physical, and digital Nintendo Switch games and Nintendo Switch accessories. For now, that's only in Canada, but I would be willing to bet money that many regions will follow suit. Okay. Why? Let's get into this. Firstly, based on market conditions is a kind of weasel-worded way of saying because we want to and we're going to do it. Because, okay, you can talk about, not to be political, but you can talk about tariffs and you can talk about, economic problems and financial issues in the world and you can talk about foreign exchange rates. Yeah, sure, okay. But the key point there is physical and digital Nintendo Switch games and Nintendo Switch accessories. A large amount of those Nintendo Switch accessories don't have problems with tariffs because they don't contain electronics from the areas that are most affected. And the digital games, they're ethereal. They aren't physical. There's no import or export duties on them. Okay? So market conditions, that's bull. They're increasing the prices because they want to. So why do they want to increase the prices on the Nintendo Switch, the OLED, the Switch Lite, and the physical and digital Nintendo Switch games and Nintendo Switch accessories? Why? If the Switch 1 console price is higher, it makes the Switch 2 look like a better deal to people going in to buy a new console. And if the Switch 1 games are higher, it makes the Switch 2 games look less pricey too. And the two combined together discourages more new Switch 1 customers from appearing, thinking that it will be good enough and they could buy cheaper games. But more importantly, perhaps, it discourages the Switch 2 owners from buying Switch 1 games to immediately then upgrade. I've had several people, both in my comments and on Reddit, tell me that they've found it's cheaper to buy the physical versions of certain games from retailers who are selling at less than RRP, and then buy the upgrade to the Switch 2 version from the Switch 1 version, which they found cheaper. And by doing that, it's cheaper than just buying the Switch 2 version directly from Nintendo. And when you do that, a portion of the sale goes to another retailer when it could have gone to Nintendo. So, of course, Nintendo don't like that. Also, developers or publishers loudly telling people to buy the Switch 1 game and then upgrade it draws more attention to the problem, and it will make more customers ask why there isn't a physical Switch 2 version. It's just not a good look. And by the way, the price increases don't just apply to the Switch 1 because, quote, other Nintendo products, including Amiibo and Nintendo Switch Online memberships, will also experience price changes. So they include the cost of Switch Online service and upgrade pack, so even if you're just a Switch 2 user, be prepared that this will likely go up in price, along with those lovely Amiibos, which you sometimes need to unlock certain game features. So many people, if you want the full experience on certain games, including Zelda games and including the upcoming Donkey Kong Bonanza as well, they kind of feel like you need the Amiibo. It's almost like kind of physical DLC. So there used to be a time when Nintendo reduced the price of their games and systems over time. I know, crazy, what a concept. They even had player's choice kind of budget ranges after games hit 1 million copies, and they bulk sold classic titles to retailers so that people buying the system when a price cut happened could easily experience what they missed out on. The NES itself was re-released as a budget system with budget games as a cheaper alternative once the Super Nintendo launched, so people who couldn't afford it could buy the NES instead. And the same happened to the Super Nintendo once the N64 launched. Every Nintendo console before the Switch got at least one major price reduction during its lifespan, and many of them got several, some of them very, very quickly, like in the case of the 3DS. But now, the Switch 1 is going up in price after the Switch 2 comes out. Nowadays, it's not even unusual for Nintendo to actually increase the price of their old games, like removing the $20 Player's Choice Pikmin 3 and Tropical Freeze versions before re-releasing barely touched new versions for $60. They're evolving just backwards. So, let's look at what different third parties have decided to do so far and rate their approach. Sega have published 4 games so far, the 3 launch titles that we covered, and Raidou Remastered. It's a Shin Megami Tensei adjacent title I'll be covering in my next episode that reviews the games from after the launch day through to August. They charge $50 for the base version of each game except Puyo Puyo Tetris 2S, which is $40. But bear in mind that's a minor update to a game that Sega regularly sells on the Switch One for $20 or in a double pack with another game. Doesn't mean it's not an excellent game, by the way. Check out my full deep dive review on it. It just means that the price isn't as cheap as it might appear. But $50 then, that seems like a win against Nintendo's $80 games, and in some ways it is. But they were only able to do so by releasing on-game keycards. Would people have been as willing to pay $60 or even $70 for Sonic X Shadow Generations to have the full game on the cartridge? Well, some core fans like me definitely would have, but when you consider that the full game on Switch 1 is $35, or just $30 on PS5, a current-gen system, that $50 already might look expensive to many, and $70 would be disastrous. Kind of harks back to the N64 days when multi-platform games were almost always $15 to $20 more expensive on the Nintendo hardware because of the cartridge costs, and that was disastrous for Nintendo in that generation. Bear in mind that for Xbox and PS5, the Blu-rays cost literal pennies to reproduce versus $17 for a Switch 2 cartridge. That's going to increase prices no matter how you look at it. On the Switch 1, the cartridge costs were a fraction of that, especially if you could fit your game onto a small cart, which would apply to most indie titles. Sega's own Raidou is on a 16GB cart for Switch 1, but they either couldn't afford to or wouldn't eat the cost of using a 64GB cart for the Switch 2 edition. Unnecessarily, bear in mind. Also bear in mind that if released day and date, there would be pressure to raise the cost of the physical PlayStation and Xbox versions too, plus the digital version, because Nintendo have a history of not approving games being released on the Switch for more expensive than on other platforms, for example, mobile versions, presumably because they want to avoid that historical perception that Nintendo versions of multi-pack games are more expensive. And as we said earlier, they're trying to enforce their digital games costing the exact same as their physical ones. Another thing that I hate as a developer. For my own games, I feel like the digital version should be, pocket money prices, like maybe $7 to $15. But if somebody wants a physical version, I'll happily sell them one for $20 to $30. I think that's reasonable considering the extra manufacturing costs and things like that. But if somebody just wants to play digitally, I'm going to make the same amount of money if they buy it for $7 than if they buy the physical version for $20 or $30. So why not? It's just being greedy, in my opinion. The other thing that I must mention is the fact that it's $50 from Sega for the base games. Sega has a nasty habit of releasing digital deluxe editions, DLC, season passes, etc. So if you want all content, you'll actually end up paying far more. Sonic and Raidou both have Day 1 DLC and deluxe editions available, so the full price is actually higher than the $50 if you want the full experience right away. And there is some controversy surrounding the seemingly excessive amount of this tactic that's being used with their upcoming Sonic Racing Crossworlds game, with editions rumoured to be $90 or even higher. That's more expensive than Mario Kart World. I think these pricing concerns and the comparatively poor sales of their existing keycard titles might be why Sega have yet to announce any release details for the game on Switch 2, despite all other systems having a launch date and base price confirmed for the 25th of September for all other systems. I'm truly looking forward to this game, and I think it could be competition for Mario Kart World, so I really hope that Sega don't drop the ball too badly or try and milk the consumer's goodwill for the Sonic brand to recoup some of their perceived losses. It's worth noting that Sega are the third party with the biggest combined sales at launch, both physically and digitally. But this isn't surprising, really, given again what we've said about Nintendo's core audience, leaning both family-friendly and retro-enthusiast collectors. Most Sega collectors switched allegiance to Nintendo once Sega stopped producing hardware, and Sonic and Monkey Ball feel the most at home on a Nintendo system. But just because they sold the best doesn't mean they sold well. Don't forget that 21% of Switch 2 owners bought no games at launch. And out of those that did, 62% were first party. So while we don't know exactly who bought more than one game, we can assume that there's only a maximum of 30% or so of customers that bought a third-party title at all. And we know that Cyberpunk takes up a massive percentage of that because it outsold every first-party game except for Mario Kart. It's not a Sega game, by the way, but it's at least tangentially adjacent in my head because of 2K. So it's worth stating that Borderlands 4 is another major third-party multiplat not releasing day and date either. We don't know the reason, but these pricing decisions and the uncertainty as to whether enough copies will sell to even make it worth it certainly aren't going to be helping. Sega also don't offer any upgrade path if you already own the Switch 1 version of Sonic or Puyo Puyo, which I have heavily criticised them for, but apparently they will be offering that with Sonic Racing Crossworlds, which tells me that they know full well that it won't be releasing on Switch 2 day and date, and they're trying not to lose out on Nintendo fans' sales by encouraging Switch 2 owners just to buy the Switch 1 version on release and then with the promise of an upgrade later. This might actually be a strong tactic to increase sales because we don't even know the upgrade cost yet, and again, like Nintendo collectors, Sega collectors and especially Sonic collectors tend to double dip. So most will probably buy the Switch 2 version in full once it releases, even after buying the Switch 1 version. It's cynical, but it works, and I'm guilty as charged as someone who often falls for this when it comes to both Nintendo and Sega with their core franchises. Again, there's something about 80s and early 90s brands that have taught our brains to want to collect things physically like the old days, which is less strong for PlayStation and even less so for Xbox. You could slap an Atari, Coleco, Intellivision, Commodore, etc. brand on something and there are a core amount of people that will just buy it regardless. I'm a little younger than most of those people, so for me that applies to Sega and Nintendo. Or indeed Capcom, Konami, SNK, Taito, etc. if it's retro-tinged. One of the most notoriously greedy third parties, EA, released a statement almost chiding Nintendo and saying that they had no intention of increasing their base price and following in their $80 game lead. Their launch game, Split Fiction, cost $50, and their announced Madden title is $70. The main difference there being that the cheaper game is a code in a box, ew, and the more expensive game is a keycard, slightly less ew, but still not great for $70. Neither is wonderful. Usually I'd prefer the keycard because you can resell them, but I mean historically there's literally zero resale for EA's yearly sports titles. We don't have a confirmation of the prices of FIFA etc, but I'd guess it's the same. Despite this seemingly cheaper approach, EA takes Sega's lead and run with it by offering a staggering $100 version of Madden. For those crazy enough to pay that, anyway. Plus, there will almost certainly be microtransactions and loot box shenanigans. There always is with the new versions of these titles, and it will be the same for FIFA. Sorry, I've just remembered it's no longer FIFA, is it? It's EA FC or whatever, or EA Club Football or something, because of licensing issues. I wonder if anyone will have already corrected me in the comments from when I mentioned it before. Go ahead, it's all engagement. Go off, King, pop off. Other massive publishers, including Take-Two Interactive and Activision Blizzard, have so far only announced code-in-a-box titles, not even bothering with game keycards, and still charging $70 for the privilege. As have Square Enix, except for Bravely Default, which came on a keycard and may or may not have had publishing help from Nintendo. I confidently stated in part 1 and in my launch lineup analysis that Nintendo were publishing that game because it's literally what it said on their website before launch. But a commenter, Serouge Gazarian, forgive me if I mispronounced that, pointed out that perhaps Nintendo only published the 3DS original and Squeenix are publishing the Switch version. And when I went back to check, the website had been quietly updated with no announcement, meaning that the information on multiple other websites was also now wrong because we all got our information from Nintendo. They also rightly corrected me that this HD remake is indeed a Switch 2 exclusive, although only exclusive remake, and the multi-platform title that I was thinking of was the sequel, Bravely Default 2. So sorry about that, and thank you for the correction. I apologize, guys. If I ever get anything wrong, I'm more than happy to be corrected in the comments, and I will always admit the mistake, correct myself, and credit the person that left the comment. So please do. Thanks again, Serouge Gazarian. In fact, while we're at it, please drop a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. This video is long and took a lot of research, and my throat is sore, so I really want the algorithm to see this video. It's totally free, of course, and it really helps me out. Thank you. I really appreciate it. So Bandai Namco, I already mentioned earlier in this video by putting out one budget game as a code in a box, but also having the distinction of releasing the cheapest current game that is fully on a cartridge in the form of Tamagotchi Plaza. If you haven't already, maybe check out my full review of that game, because even if you think you aren't interested in it, it's a quality little title, but more importantly, it tells us some very interesting things about the potential future for Switch 2, including future release strategies, region differences, the use of hardware features like mouse mode and innovative IR sensor use. I can't give them a pass for code in a box for Shadow Labyrinth. However, that game is only $30. And they offer a free update if you buy the physical Switch 1 version, which does come on the cart. You see, that shows exactly the dilemma that I was talking about earlier, and as I mentioned in part 1, it's the very same problem that I'm facing with my own games as an indie developer. For the titles that I make, hopefully really polished and high-quality experiences, but ones that I consider quite small and retro-inspired, I'm not really comfortable charging more than, say, $30 for a physical small print run for collectors. To me, that's the sweet spot, and it seems fair, following in the lead of games like Shredder's Revenge or Doki Doki Literature Club, that kind of thing. That price point is absolutely very possible when putting out a Switch 1 release. We've seen countless of them. But by the time you take into account the box, label printing, posting, import and export fees, warehouse stockages, retailers' commission, it's basically impossible to release a Switch 2 version for $30 using the $17 64GB cart. And even the slightly cheaper keycard is pushing whether you'd make any money on the sale. So, do I raise the price to $45? And charge the customers $15 more for Nintendo's mistake? I think people are a lot less likely to buy a small indie title for $45 than they are for, say, $30. So I understand Bandai Namco's decision to release the $30 game as a code in a box, and I give them full credit for offering that free upgrade and putting out a Switch 1 version. Similarly, Hello Games didn't seem to bother releasing any kind of physical Switch 2 version of No Man's Sky, as far as I can tell, instead just offering a free upgrade from the physical 1 Switch version. It appears that Level 5 did the same for Fantasy Life I, but they charged just $2.59 to upgrade. I applaud both of them for not wanting to overcharge their customers, but I do wonder just how many more copies they would sell if there was a version in a nice Switch 2 box. It's either hurt your customers or hurt your own sales. Shout to user Jess Alexander Bunch 9599, by the way, who left me several comments saying he's really enjoying No Man's Sky on the Switch 2, and had been playing for over a week when he messaged me and said it was a really good version. So excellent, I'm glad he's enjoying it. CD Projekt Red, of course, are the publishers of Cyberpunk 2077, and I've already glazed them in several videos, even separate clip too, because in my opinion they are doing it right, and even better than Nintendo themselves, by releasing the full game on the 64GB cart and including a manual, stickers, and other nice little things in the package, which Nintendo don't bother to do even on their $80 games. And they include all DLC in the package and don't charge extra for it, which I still can't get over Nintendo trying to pull with Breath of the Wild. However, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't push back very slightly. It's worth mentioning that in the launch window for Switch 1, it was also only CD Projekt Red that utilized a 32GB cartridge, the maximum capacity for the Switch 1, and maybe the only third party to use one? I don't remember another one offhand. So there's one of two things going on here. Either CD Projekt Red are just super effing ethical and really strongly believe in releasing fully physical titles for the sake of preservation and quality, or they got some kind of deal with Nintendo to get the maximum capacity cartridges for cheaper or subsidized because of how much of an asset these true AAA critical darlings and hardcore gamer favorites would be at the launch of both consoles. I'm not a conspiracy theorist and I have nothing to base that on, but it does seem plausible. We covered them in large detail in part 1, but the star of the show is Marvelous, who have 3 games confirmed this year, including Rune Factory, Guardians of Azuma, which is out now. And all 3 of the games are on the cartridge in full. And the head of the company says that that's the plan going forward too for all other games, and gave exactly the same reasons and sentiments that I feel myself as a developer. And I found his words moving and inspiring. I'm glad that I'm not the only person who feels this way and is at least trying to keep the physical collector's ship afloat. However, I do need to make a minor correction. I mentioned that one commenter told me that Rune Factory came with a 31-page colour manual, but I've had 2 European viewers, Casper Egas from the Netherlands and Gilater in Germany, both say that they bought Rune Factory, but it didn't come with a manual. I would speculate that perhaps this is due to the extra cost of translating and printing multiple manuals. It's a shame, but I understand. I still congratulate Marvelous for trying to do things right and releasing on the physical cartridge. And both commenters, by the way, stated that they are really enjoying the game, and after speaking to them both, I'm even more so very much looking forward to trying it out for my forthcoming full review. Make sure to subscribe to that one. But in the meantime, you have it on the authority of several of my viewers that it's a good time. And thanks again to you both for the helpful comments. However, with Marvelous, all 3 of their games cost at least $60, which is a good price point for the experiences they're offering and cheaper than $80 for Nintendo's top games. But as I said, for my own games, I prefer to keep the price to around $30, unless doing some crazy special edition collector's bundle that has like plushies or figurines or something. So how can Nintendo fix this problem? Because these are fixable problems. And this is why I'm making this video, and this is why I want more people to talk about this. Number 1 solution. Allow Switch 2 games to use smaller capacity cartridges, which already exist and are fully compatible with the hardware. So Nintendo can do this for free, for no extra work. They just need to agree to it. This is the best solution. But if not, solution 2. Allow publishers to use Switch 2 style packaging and Switch 2 logos on the artwork, but include an actual Switch 1 version of the game inside, which is compatible with Switch 2 and includes a free upgrade. Again, this wouldn't cost Nintendo anything to implement. They just need to agree to let their copyrighted logos be used in this way. For example, I'm thinking of that No Man's Sky release. You could just have the Switch 1 cart inside a box, but with the Switch 2 logos on the outside. Why not? And a bit of text that says this will run on Switch 1 and 2. This isn't such a crazy idea. Both Xbox and PlayStation have offered standardized packaging in the style of the modern consoles, but where the game will run on both current and last gen. It's an elegant solution that solves both issues. And as the Switch 2 boxes are the same size, we could even offer reversible sleeves so that collectors can decide if they want it to match either their Switch 1 or Switch 2 games. I'd love to do that. But again, sadly, it's only possible if Nintendo will allow it, because you can't just put Nintendo logos on commercial products without their permission. Third solution. If for some reason Nintendo knows something that we don't, and Macronics are stopping production of cart sizes under 64GB, which, by the way, is highly unlikely, but I'm trying to give them the benefit of the doubt. Allow versions of your cards where publishers can insert standard microSD cards inside with adapters to interface with the SPI-like game memory interface. Sooner or later, an unlicensed third party is going to do that anyway. Sure, it's more vulnerable to piracy, but if you do it first, you make it less likely that someone else will do it, and your carts already have a lockout built in anyway. There was a rumor going around before Switch 2's launch that you could release slower cartridges with the game on, but which would require installation on the hardware, like the PS5 and Xbox games do. That would work, but that was predicted based on the idea that the reason Nintendo wants you to use 64GB carts is because they somehow read faster. And as I said earlier, that turned out not to be the case by much, or even at all. However, there definitely are solutions to use older, cheaper versions of Flash-based ROMs based on older standards which do read slower but are much cheaper and could interface in with the SPI just as I mentioned. Or, number 4 solution, reduce the price of the 64GB cards. Probably they can't do that right now, but I imagine that this will happen over time as they become easier and cheaper to manufacture. And we can only hope that as the production costs come down, Nintendo reduces the amount that they charge third parties to use them, rather than just making more profit per unit. We can only hope. So one final point. There were a lot of people in my comments saying that they were refusing to buy a Switch 2 because of all of this, and the majority of them sounded sad rather than angry. Most shared that they've been long-term Nintendo fans and supporters, some of them since the days of the NES. I completely understand where they are coming from. Some of the decisions from Nintendo and their responses to criticism have been frankly very upsetting to me as a fan, and despite me really rooting for them to succeed, I really do think that they need to change their attitude if they don't want a repeat of previous generations' disasters. As we covered in part 1, just because a console sells big numbers in its first few weeks of launch does not mean it won't crash and burn in a short while, like the Dreamcast that tragically took Sega's hardware business down with it after only 18 months or so, despite literally breaking sales records left, right and centre in the beginning. Nintendo needs to learn from their past and remember that the very people that saved their asses in the last multiple times that they've nearly lost everything are the very people that they are alienating right now. Many people in the comments said that they're boycotting game keycards and not buying them. And some might have the sentiment that this will teach devs a lesson and they will just learn to not release games on them. I mean, kinda. But I honestly think the lesson is more likely to be that they'll learn not to release games physically at all and go digital only. Or perhaps just skip the Switch 2 entirely, which, like previous generations after the NES but before the Switch 1, will end up doing untold damage to the console in the long run. Fine if you don't plan on buying a Switch 2 at any point in the future, but if you own the system or plan on buying one at some point if there's enough games that you want, I'd encourage you to think about buying them when there is a game that you want to play that just happens to be on a game keycard. Look, I understand the whole don't spend real money on fake games train of thought. Makes sense in a way, but that would also mean avoiding buying games digitally either. So by doing that, you're going to mean that you can't play what will probably be more than 90% of the games released for the system in the future. But if you are going to buy digital games and are just avoiding the keycards themselves, just consider for a second that they cost the same as buying them digitally, but you have a box to display and you can resell them in the future. By buying digitally, the only advantage that I can see is you don't have to insert the cart to play, but you still probably don't want to leave all your games permanently installed, as you'll run out of space pretty quickly. I don't know. I still hate them out of principle because of what they represent happening, but they're far better than digital only, and I understand why most third-party devs seem to feel forced to use them. A few days ago, at Nintendo's shareholder meeting, one of the shareholders basically stood up and asked a question about game keycards, saying they didn't think they were a good idea and would hurt third parties. In front of their investors and on record for the world, Nintendo very publicly doubled down on them. Quote, "The game key card does not contain the game itself, but rather a key for activation. A download is required when playing for the first time. It was adopted because of the internal storage capacity of the Nintendo Switch 2 is larger than that of the Nintendo Switch. We will make efforts to ensure that the third-party software sells well." End quote. Obviously that's translated and from an interpreter, but it's a complete nothing burger. Perhaps what they're trying to allude to is that for the larger third-party games that won't fit on the maximum 64GB of cartridge, they are useful, and they increase the internal storage of the Switch 2 to allow for large games to be installed. Although at only 256GB, you aren't going to fit too many game sizes over 64GB on them now, are you? The statement does nothing to explain why all the games that could have been on a cartridge weren't, because Nintendo are forcing the costs much higher and refusing devs to use cartridge sizes that already exist for Switch 1 and use the same technology, the only real difference being the colour of the bloomin' plastic. It's basically a politician's platitude response that doesn't answer anything, but they hope will sound good to investors that don't understand the actual issues that the person who asked the question was trying to raise. It is super annoying. But we're used to Nintendo being stubborn by now, and to be honest, making these kind of empty statements isn't bad, it's just business. Speaking of which, I had a handful of commenters who I won't call out here as I don't want anyone to harass them, but they were getting irrationally angry with Nintendo to the point of claiming that they're like the most evil company in the world, and one even saying that he's so disgusted with Nintendo that any developer who even puts their game onto a Nintendo platform should be boycotted and they wouldn't even buy their games on another platform like Steam out of protest. Let's be realistic for a second. None of this is the third-party developers or publishers' fault. All of these decisions by Nintendo, not them. And all of them will have, just like me, been working on their games for many years, excited for the day that they can finally share it with the world, and they want as many people as possible to be able to enjoy them. As developers and publishers, we can't reasonably boycott Nintendo, especially not for those like me that are making games that predominantly appeal to Nintendo's fanbase. But also, evil? I really don't think that quite applies here. Greedy, yes. Short-sighted to the point of actual idiocy, absolutely. But if you boycott people simply selling games on a Nintendo platform because you think the company is evil, you'd better also boycott any publisher selling their games on Amazon, the shelves of any major supermarket or retailer, on the Apple App Store, Google Play, and definitely any hardware even slightly associated with Microsoft or Sony. What does that leave you? The Steam Deck, if using only the Linux Steam OS without Windows? Oh wait, I just saw that CoffeeZilla video about Steam profiting from getting children hooked on gambling. I promised another user that I'd try not to get political in my videos, and I don't want to, but you can't really go down this boycott route and still support anything that you may have heard of because of the current state of capitalism and the companies that allow you to hear of products in the first place. You should absolutely support small, passionate indie artists, whether musicians, writers, painters, poets, filmmakers, or, yes, indie game devs. Unfortunately, to do so, you usually have to use platforms owned by companies who sometimes do unsavory stuff. Heck, no matter what service or device you're listening to this on, you're doing so right now. And while it's tempting to get super angry at Nintendo because you feel let down by them, that's something I'm probably guilty of myself, it's important to keep some perspective on just how serious raising the price of Mario Kart by $10 truly is in the grand scheme of things. And yes, again, support indie artists. And if you want to support this indie artist and his indie podcast, be sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe to the show. Check out all the links to support and consider joining our free members area where I'll be doing free giveaways of official Nintendo prizes, all at linktree/dailyswitch2. That's linktr.ee/dailyswitch2. This was a very long one, so if you've listened to the end, thank you. Have a cookie. Next episode, we'll be back with the first of my promised many deep dives into Donkey Kong Bonanza. I literally can't wait for that game. It looks so effing great. Salut! Merci à tous!